The Case of Joe Attymar. Chapter 1. In the dusk of the evening, the rower brought his skiff under the overshadowing hull of the Baltic steamer and rested on his oars, the little boat rising and falling gently in the swell of the river. A grimy second officer looked down from the open porthole and spat thoughtfully into the water. Apparently, he did not see the swarthy-faced waterman with the tuft of grey beard, and as apparently the waterman was oblivious of his appearance. Presently, the unshaven man, with the faded gold band on the wrist of his shabby jacket, drew in his head and shoulders and disappeared. A few seconds later, a square wooden case was heaved through the port and fell with a splash in the water. For a moment, one sharp corner was in sight. Then it sank slowly beneath the yellow flood. A small black buoy bobbed up, and the waterman watched it with interest. To the buoy was attached a stout cord, and the cord was fastened to the case. He waited, moving his oars slowly, until the buoy was on the point of being sucked out of sight. Then, with a turn of his wrist, he hooked an oar under the cord, literally hooked, for at the end of the short blade was a little steel crook. Pushing the boat forward, he reached for the buoy and drew this into the stern sheets, fastened the cord round a wooden pin, and lifting his oars, allowed the tide to carry him under the steamer's stern. Anchored in midstream was a dingy-looking barge, and towards this he guided the skiff. A heavily built young man came from the aft deck and, reaching down a boat hook, drew the skiff alongside. The swarthy man held on to the side of the barge, whilst the boat hook was transferred to the taut line astern. The younger man did no more than fasten the soaking cord to a small bight. By this time, the occupant of the skiff was on board. "Nobody about, Ligsey?" he asked gruffly. "Nobody, Captain," said the younger man. The captain said nothing more, but walked to the deck-house astern and disappeared down the companionway, pulling the hatch close after him. There he stayed till the estuary was a black void, punctured with dim ship's lights. Ligsey went forward to where his youthful assistant sat on an overturned bucket, softly playing a mouth organ. He stopped being musical long enough to remark that the tide was turning. "We going up tonight?" he asked. Ligsey nodded. He had already heard the chuff-chuff of the motor in the stern of the barge, where the skipper was starting it. "What we hanging around here for?" asked the youth curiously. "We've missed one tide. We could have been up to Greenwich by now. Why don't Captain Attymar?" "Mind your own business," growled the mate. He heard the swarthy man calling him and went aft. "We'll get that case in and stow it," he said in a low voice. "I left a place in the bricks." Together they pulled gingerly at the cord and brought the square, soaked packing case to sight. Ligsey leaned over and gripped it with an instrument like a pair of huge ice tongs, and the dripping case was brought to the narrow deck and stowed expeditiously in the well of the barge. The Allanuna invariably carried bricks between a little yard on the Essex coast and Thames wharf. Everybody on the river knew her for an erratic and a dangerous steering craft. The loud chuffing of her engine was an offence. Even nippy tugboats gave her yawing bows a wide berth. The boy was called aft to take charge of the engine, and Ligsey took the tiller. It was 5 o'clock on a spring morning when she came to Thames wharf, which is at Rotherhithe. As a wharfage, it had few qualities attractive to the least fastidious of barges. It consisted of a confined space with room for 2 builders' lorries to be backed side by side, though it required some manoeuvring to bring them into position, and the shabby little house where Joe Attymar lived. Through the weather-beaten gate, which opened at intervals to admit the builders' carts, was Shadwick Lane. It had none of the picturesque character of the slum it used to be, when its houses were of wood, and water-butts stood in every backyard. Nowadays it consists of 4 walls, 2 on either side of the street. Bridging these is an inverted V of slate, which is called a roof, and at frequent intervals there are 4 red chimney pots set on a small, square, brick tower. These denote roughly where lateral walls divide one hutch from another. Each partition is called a house, for which people pay rent when they can afford it. The walls which face the street have 3 windows and a doorway to each division. Joe Attymar's house did not properly stand in the lane at all, and Shadwick Lane was only remotely interested in the barge-master for the curious reason that he could reach his house and yard by Shadwick Passage, a tortuous alley that threaded a way between innumerable backyards, and, under the shadow of a high warehouse, to Tooley Street. Year after year, the swarthy man with the little iron-grey beard and the shaggy eyebrows brought his barge up the river, always with a cargo of bricks. And invariably the barge went down empty and without his presence, for some reason there was neither passenger nor crew on the downriver trip. This fact was unknown to the people of Shadwick Lane. They were even unaware that Joe Attymar did not sleep in his house more than one night every month. They knew, of course, from the muddy old motor car that he drove through the wide gates occasionally, that he went abroad, but guessed that he was engaged in the legitimate business of lighterman. There are certain minor problems which from time to time cause the chiefs of Scotland Yard to move uneasily and impatiently in their padded chairs and say to their immediate subordinates, "Do something." Mr. Attymar, though he was blissfully unaware of the fact, was one of these minor problems. There are gaming houses which harass the police, queer little clubs, and other establishments less easy to write about in a reputable magazine, but Mr. Attymar was not associated with one of these. Such problems are, in one shape or another, perennial. Occasionally they grow acute, and just at that moment the question of systematic smuggling was worrying Scotland Yard considerably. Chief Constable Mason sent for Inspector Gaylor. "They've pulled in a fellow who was peddling dope in Ligsey Street last night," he said. "You might see him after his remand. I have an idea he will squeak." But the man in question was no squeaker, though he had certainly given that impression when he was taken red-handed. He said enough, however, to the patient detective to suggest that he might say more. "All that I could find out," said Gaylor, "is that this selling organization is nearly foolproof. The gang that we rushed last year isn't handling the output, but I'm satisfied that it still has the same governor." "Get him," said the chief, who was in the habit of asking for miracles in the same tone as he asked for his afternoon tea. And then a thought struck him. "Go along and see Reader. The public prosecutor was telling me today that Reader is available for any extra work. He may be able to help anyway." Mr. Reader heard the request, sighed and shook his head. "I'm afraid it is rather, outside my line of business. Dope? There used to be a man named Moodle. It may not have been his name, but he had associations with these wretched people." "Moodle, whose name was Sam Oshkolinski, has been dead nearly a year," said Gaylor. "Dear me," said Mr. Reader, in a hushed voice appropriate to one who has lost a dear friend. "Of what did he die?" "Loss of breath," said Gaylor vulgarly. Mr. Reader knew nothing more that he could recall about dope merchants. "Haven't you some record on your files?" suggested Gaylor. "I never keep files, except, nail files," said Mr. Reader. "Perhaps," suggested Gaylor, "one of your peculiar friends." "I have no friends," said Mr. Reader. But here he did not speak the exact truth. He was cursed with a community spirit, and he had a tremendous sense of neighborly obligations. Especially would he give up valuable time to diagnosing and curing the mysterious diseases which attack the chickens in Brockley Road. Mr. Reader was an authority on poultry. He knew exactly why hens droop and cockerels' combs go pink. He had a marvelous chicken farm in Kent, not large, but rare. Noble lords and ladies consulted him before they exhibited their birds. He could wash and dry living chickens for the bench. The poultry show at the Crystal Palace was an event to which Mr. Reader looked forward for 11 months and 2 weeks. He would stand in his back garden for hours discussing with the man next door the eccentricities of laying hens, and his acquaintance with Johnny Southers began in a fowl house. Johnny lived 3 doors from Mr. Reader. He was rather a nice young man, fair-haired and good-looking. He had, in Mr. Reader's eyes, the overwhelming advantage of being a very poor conversationalist. Anna Welford lived in the house opposite, so that it may be said that the scene was set for the curious tragedy of Joe Attymar on a very small stage. It was through the unromantic question of a disease which attacked Johnny Southers' prize Wyandottes that Mr. Reader met Anna. She happened to be in the Southers' back garden when Mr. Reader was engaged in his diagnosis. She was a slim girl, rather dark, with amazing brown eyes. Her father was a retired fish merchant who had made a lot of money and had sent her to a high-class school at Brighton, where girls are taught to ride astride, use lipstick, and adore the heroes of Hollywood. In some respects, her education had been neglected, for she returned to the dullness of Brockley a very sane, well-balanced young lady. She did not find Brockley a hole. She did not smoke or do anything which made life worth living, but settled down to the humdrum of a stuffy home as though she had never shared a room with an earl's daughter or played hockey against an all-England team. Johnny did not fall in love with her at first sight. He had known her since she was so high. When he was a boy, she was endurable to him. As a young man, he thought her views on life were sound. He discovered he was in love with her as he discovered he was taller than his father. It was a subject for surprise. It was brought home to him when Mr. Clive Desboyne called in his glittering coupe to take Anna to a dinner dance. He resented Mr. Desboyne's easy assurance, the proprietorial way he handed Anna into the car. He thought it was appalling bad manners for a man to smoke a cigar when he was driving a lady. Thereafter, Johnny found himself opening and examining packing cases and casks and barrels at the customs house with a sense of his inferiority and the hopelessness of his future. In such a mood he consulted his authority on poultry, and Mr. Reader listened with all the interest of one who was hearing a perfectly novel and original story that had never been told before by or to any human being. "I know so very little, about love," said Mr. Reader awkwardly. "In fact, nothing. I would like to advise you to, let matters take their course." Very excellent, if vague, advice. But matters took the wrong course, as it happened. Chapter 2. On the following Saturday night, as Mr. Reader was returning home, he saw two men fighting in Brockley Road. He had what is called in Portuguese a repugnatio to fighting men. When the hour was midnight and the day was Saturday, there was a considerable weight of supposition in favour of the combat being between two gentlemen who were the worse for intoxicating drink, and it was invariably Mr. Reader's practice to cross like the Philistine to the other side of the road. But the two young men who were engaged in such a short, silent and bitter contest were obviously no hooligans of Lower Deptford. They were both wearing evening dress, and gentlemen in evening dress do not as a rule wage war in the streets of Brockley. Nevertheless, Mr. Reader hardly felt it was the occasion to act either as mediator or timekeeper. He would have passed them by, and did in fact come level with them, when one walked across the road, leaving his companion, though that hardly seems the term to apply to one who had been so bruised and exhausted that he was hanging on to the railings to recover as best he could. It was then that Mr. Reader saw that one of the contestants was Mr. John Southers. He was husky and apologetic. "I'm terribly sorry to have made a fuss like this," he said. "I hope my father didn't hear me. This fellow is intolerable." The intolerable man on the other side of the street was moving slowly towards where a car was parked by the sidewalk. They watched him in silence as he got in, and turning the car violently, went off towards the Lewisham High Road, and, from the direction he took, London. "I've been to a dance," said the young man, a little inconsequently. "I hope," said Mr. Reader, with the greatest gentleness, "that you enjoyed yourself." Mr. Southers did not seem disposed at the moment to offer a fuller explanation. As they neared Reader's gate, he said, "Thank God, Anna was inside before it started. He has been beastly rude to me all the evening. As a matter of fact, she asked me to call and take her home, otherwise I shouldn't have met him." There had been a dance somewhere in the city, at a livery hall. Anna had gone with Mr. Clive Desboyne, but the circumstances under which Johnny called for her were only vaguely detailed. Nor did Mr. Reader hear what was the immediate cause of the quarrel which had set two respectable young men at fisticuffs in the reputable suburban thoroughfare. To say that he was uninterested would not be true. The matter, however, was hardly pressing. He hoped that both parties to the little fracas might have forgotten the cause of their quarrel by the following morning. He did not see Johnny again for the remainder of the week. Mr. Reader went about his business, and it is doubtful whether Johnny occupied as much as 5 minutes of his thoughts until the case of Joe Attymar came into his purview. He was again called to Scotland Yard on a consultation. He found Gaylor and the chief constable together, and they were examining a very dingy-looking letter which had come to the yard in the course of the day. "Sit down, Reader," said the chief. "Do you know a man called Attymar?" Mr. Reader shook his head. He had never heard of Joe Attymar. "This is a thing we could do ourselves without any bother at all," interrupted the chief. "But there are all sorts of complications which I won't bother you with. We believe there's a member of the staff of one of the legations in this business, and naturally we want this fact to come out accidentally, and not as the result of any direct investigation by the police." Mr. Reader then learned about Joe Attymar, the barge-master of the little wharf at the end of Shadwick Lane, and the barge Allanuna that went up and down the Thames year in and year out and brought bricks. He did not hear at that moment, or subsequently, what part the legation played, or which legation it was, or if there was any legation at all. In justice to his acumen, it must be said that he doubted this part of the story from the first, and the theory at which he eventually arrived, and which was probably correct, was that the part he was called upon to play was to stampede Attymar and his associates into a betrayal of their iniquity. For this was at a period when Mr. Reader's name and appearance were known from one end of the river to the other, when there was hardly a bargee or tug-hand who could not have drawn, and did not draw, a passable caricature of that worthy man who had been instrumental in breaking up one of the best organized gangs of river thieves that had ever amalgamated for an improper purpose. Mr. Reader scratched his nose, and his lips drooped dolefully. "I was hoping, that I should not see that interesting stream for a very long time." He sat down and listened patiently to a string of uninteresting facts. Joe Attymar brought bricks up the river, had been bringing them for many years, at a price slightly lower than his competitors. He carried for 4 builders, and apparently did a steady, if not too prosperous, trade. He was believed locally to be rolling in money, but that is a reputation which Shadwick Lane applied to any man or woman who was not forced at frequent intervals to make a call at the local pawnshop. He kept himself to himself, was unmarried, and had no apparent interests outside of his brick lighterage. "Fascinating," murmured Mr. Reader. "It sounds almost like a novel, doesn't it?" After he had gone, "I don't see what there is fascinating about it," said Mason, who did not know Mr. Reader very well. "That's his idea of being funny," said Gaylor. It was a week later, and the Allanuna lay at anchor off Queensborough, when a small boat, rowed by a local boatman, carrying a solitary passenger, came slowly out under the watchful and suspicious eye of Ligsey. The boat rowed alongside the barge, and Ligsey had a view of a man with a square hat and lopsided pince-nez, who sat in the stern of the boat, an umbrella between his legs, apparently making a meal of the big handle. And, seeing him, Ligsey, who knew a great deal about the river and its scandals, started up from his seat with an exclamation. He was blinking stupidly at the occupant of the boat when Mr. Reader came up to him. "Good morning," said Mr. Reader. Ligsey said nothing. "I suppose I should say afternoon," continued the punctilious Mr. Reader. "Is the captain aboard?" Ligsey cleared his throat. "No, sir, he ain't." "I suppose you wouldn't object if I came aboard?" Mr. Reader did not wait for the answer, but, with surprising agility, drew himself up onto the narrow deck of the barge. He looked round with mild interest. The hatches were off, and he had a good view of the cargo. "Bricks are very interesting things," he said pleasantly. "Without bricks we should have no houses. Without straw we should have no bricks. It seems therefore a very intelligent act to pack bricks in straw, to remind them, as it were, of what they owe to this humble, vegetable." Ligsey did not speak, but swallowed something. "What I want to know," Mr. Reader went on, and his eyes were never still, "is this. Would it be possible to hire this barge?" "You'll have to ask the captain about that," said Ligsey huskily. His none too clean face was a shade paler. The stories of Reader that had come down the river had gained in the telling. He was credited with supernatural powers of divination. His knowledge and perspicuity were unbounded. For the first time in years, Ligsey found himself confronted with the slowly moving machinery of the law. It was a little terrifying, and his emotions were not at all what he had anticipated. He used to tell Joe Attymar, "If they ever come to me, I'll give 'em a saucy answer." And here they had come to him, but no saucy answer hovered on his lips. He felt totally inadequate. "When are you expecting the captain?" asked Mr. Reeder in his blandest manner. "Tonight or tomorrow? I don't know," stammered Ligsey. "He'll pick us up, I suppose." "Gone ashore for dispatches?" asked Mr. Reeder pleasantly. "Or possibly to wire to the owners?" "No, no, it couldn't be that. He is the owner. How interesting. He'll be coming off in a few moments with sealed orders under his arm. Will you tell me," he pointed to the hold, "why you leave that square aperture in the bricks? Is that one of the secrets of packing, or shall I say stowage?" Ligsey went whiter. "We always leave it like that," he said, and did not recognize the sound of his own voice. Mr. Reeder would have descended to the cabin, but the hatch was padlocked. He did invite himself down to the little cubby-hole in the bow of the boat where Ligsey and the boy slept, and, strangely enough, Mr. Reeder carried in his pocket, although it was broad daylight, a very powerful electric hand-lamp which revealed every corner of Ligsey's living place as it had never been revealed before. "Rather squalid, isn't it?" asked Mr. Reeder. "A terrible thing to have to live in these circumstances and conditions, but of course one can live in a much worse place." He made this little speech after his return to the fresh air of the deck, and was fanning himself with the brim of his high-crowned hat. "One can live, for example," he went on, surveying the picturesque shore of Queensborough vacantly, "in a nice, clean prison. I know plenty of men who would rather live in prison than at, Buckingham Palace, though, of course, I have no knowledge that they've ever been invited to Buckingham Palace, but not respectable men, men with wives and families." Ligsey's face was a blank. "With girls and mothers." Ligsey winced. "They would prefer to remain outside. And, of course, they can remain outside if they're only sufficiently sensible to make a statement to the police." He took from his pocketbook a card and handed it almost timorously to Ligsey. "I live there," said Mr. Reeder, "and I'll be glad to see you any time you're passing. Are you interested in poultry?" Ligsey was interested in nothing. Mr. Reeder signalled to the boatman, who pulled the skiff alongside, and he stepped down into the boat and was rowed back to the shore. There was one who had seen him come and who watched him leave by train. When night fell, Joe Attymar rowed out to the barge and found a very perturbed lieutenant. "Old Reeder's been here," blurted Ligsey, but Joe stopped him with a gesture. "Want to tell the world about it?" he snarled. "Come aft." The thick-set young man followed his commander. "I know Reeder's been here. I've seen him. What did he want?" Briefly, Ligsey told him quite a number of unimportant details about the visit. It was not remarkable that he did not make any reference to the card or to Mr. Reeder's invitation. "That's done it," said Ligsey when he had finished. "Old Reeder's got a nose like a hawk. Asked me why we left that hole in the bricks. I've never had to deal with a detective before." "You haven't, eh?" sneered the other. "Who was that waterman who came aboard off Gravesend the other night? And why did I drop 1/2 weight of good stuff overboard, eh? You fool. We've had 6 of these fellows on board, all of them cleverer than Reeder. Did he ask you to tell him anything?" "No," said Ligsey instantly. Joe Attymar thought for a little time, and then, "We'll get up the anchor. I'm not waiting for the Dutch boat," he said. Ligsey's sigh of relief was audible at the other end of the barge. Chapter 3. This visit of Reeder was the culmination of a series of inquiries he had conducted in the course of a few days. He turned in a short report to Scotland Yard and went home to Brockley Road, overtaking Johnny Southers as he turned from Lewisham High Road. Johnny was not alone. "Anna and I were discussing you," he said, as they slackened their steps to match the more leisurely pace of Mr. Reeder. "Is it possible for us to see you for 5 minutes?" It was possible. Mr. Reeder ushered them up to his big, old-fashioned sitting room, inwardly hoping that the consultation would have no reference to the mysterious workings of the young and human heart. They were going to get married. Anna's father knows, and he's been awfully decent about it, said Johnny. And I'd like you to know too, Mr. Reader. Mr. Reader murmured something congratulatory. That matter of love and loving was at any rate shelved. And Desboyne has been awfully decent. I told Anna all about that rather unpleasant little scene you witnessed. He never told her a word. He wrote apologizing to Anna, and wrote an apology to me. He has offered me a very good position in Singapore if I care to take it. He's terribly rich, and it sounds very good. It doesn't sound good to me. Anna's voice was decisive. I appreciate Clive's generosity, but I don't think he ought to give up his civil service work except for something better in England. I want you to persuade him, Mr. Reader. Mr. Reader looked from one to the other dismally. The idea of persuading anybody to do anything in which he himself was not greatly absorbed filled him with dismay. As a mentor to the young, he recognized his limitations. He liked Johnny Southers as he liked any decent young fellow. He thought Anna Welford was extraordinarily pretty, but even these two facts in conjunction could not arouse him to enthusiasm. I don't want much persuading, said Johnny to his relief. I've got something else up my sleeve, a pretty big thing. I'm not at liberty to talk about it. In fact, I've been asked not to. If that comes off, the Singapore job will be refused. It isn't so very difficult now. The point is this, Mr. Reader. If you were offered a partnership in a thriving concern, that could be made into something very big if one put one's heart and soul into it. Would you accept? Mr. Reader looked at the ceiling and sighed. Hypotheses always worry me, Mr. Southers. Perhaps, when the moment comes, if you could tell me all about the business, I may be able to advise you, although I confess I have never been regarded as a man whose advice was worth two, hoots. That's what I wanted to see you about, Mr. Reader. Anna nodded slowly. I'm so terribly afraid of Johnny leaving the service for an uncertainty, and I do want him to talk the matter over with you. I don't want to know his secrets. There was the ghost of a smile in her eyes. I think I know most of them, that count. Mr. Reader looked round miserably. He felt himself caught and entangled in a network of dull domesticity. He was, if the truth be told, immensely bored, and, had he been more temperamental, he might have screamed. He wished he had not overtaken these loitering lovers, or that they would apply to one of those periodicals which maintain a department devoted to advising the young and the sentimental in the choice of their careers. It was with the greatest happiness that he closed the door upon their small mystery and devoted himself to the serious business of high tea. Mr. Reader had many anxieties to occupy his mind in the next few days, and the fact that he had added Joe Attymar to the list of his enemies, even if he were aware of the fact, was not one of these. In the jails of a dozen countries were men who actively disliked him. Meister of Hamburg, who used to sell United States bills by the hundredweight, Lefebvre, the clever wholesale engraver of Leonotes, Monsata, who specialized in English fivers, Madame Penser of Pisa, who for many years was the chief distributor of forged money in Eastern and Southern Europe, Al Selinsky, the papermaker, Don Leishmer, who printed French miles by the thousand. They all knew Mr. Reader, at least by name, and none of them had a good word for him except Monsata, who was large-minded and could detach himself from his personal misfortunes. Letters came to Mr. Reader from many peculiar sources. It was a curious fact that a very large number of Mr. Reader's correspondents were women. A sensible number of the letters which came to him were of a most embarrassing character. His name had been mentioned in many cases that had been heard at the Old Bailey. He himself had, from time to time, stood up in the witness stand, a lugubrious and unhappy figure, and had given evidence in his hesitant and deferential way against all manner of wrongdoers, but mostly forgers. He was variously described as an expert, as a private detective, as a bank official. In a sense, he was all these, yet none of them entirely. Judges and certain barristers knew that he was at the call of the public prosecutor's department. It was said that privately he enjoyed a status equivalent in rank to a superintendent of police. He certainly had a handsome retaining fee from the Bankers' Association and probably drew pay from the government, but nobody knew his business. He banked at Torquay, and the manager of the bank was his personal friend. But the net result of his fugitive appearances in court was that quite intelligent women were seized with the idea that he was the man who should be employed to watch their husbands and to procure the evidence necessary for their divorces. Businessmen wrote to him asking him to investigate the private lives of their partners. Quite a few commissions were offered by important commercial concerns, but none of these appealed to Mr. Reader, and with his own hand he would write long and carefully punctuated letters explaining that he was not a private detective in the real sense of the word. He was not surprised, therefore, when, some 4 days after his talk with Johnny Southers, he received a letter addressed from a Park Lane flat, requesting his services. He turned first to the signature and with some difficulty deciphered it as Clive Desboyne. For a moment, the name, whilst it had a certain familiarity, was difficult to attach, and then he remembered the quarrel he had witnessed and realized that this was the other party to that unhappy conflict. The letter was typewritten and ran, "Dear Sir, I happen to know your private address because Miss Welford pointed it out to me one evening when I was visiting her. I am in rather a delicate position, and I am wondering whether I could employ your services professionally to extricate myself. Since the matter affects Southers, whom I think you know, I have learned since that you were a witness of a certain disgraceful episode, for which I was probably more to blame than he. I thought you might be willing to receive me. I want you to undertake this task on a professional basis and charge me your usual fees. I shall be out of town until Friday night, but there is no immediate urgency. If I could call some time after 10 on Friday, I should be eternally grateful. Yours, etc." Mr. Reader's first inclination was to take out a sheet of paper and write a firm but polite refusal to see Mr. Desboyne, however stringent might be his predicament. He had written the first 3 words when one of those curious impulses which came to him at times and which so often urged him to the right course stayed his hand. Instead, he took a telegraph form and sent a laconic message agreeing to the young man's suggestion. The day of the appointment was a busy one for Mr. Reader. Scotland Yard had made 2 important discoveries. A small garage in the north of London, which contained nearly £400 of saccharin, had been raided in the early hours of the morning, and this was followed up by a second raid in a West End mansion flat, where large quantities of heroin and cocaine were unearthed by the police. "It looks as though we found one of the principal distributing agents," said Gaylor. "We've got the barge under observation, and we're taking the chance of arresting Attymar as soon as he steps on board." "Where is it?" "Off Greenwich," said Gaylor. Mr. Reader dived down into his pocket and produced an envelope. The paper was grimy, the address was a scrawl. He took from this as dingy a letter and laid it on the table before Gaylor. "Dear Sir, I can give you information. I will call at your house on Sunday morning. From a friend." Gaylor inspected the envelope. The date stamp was Greenwich. He had some doubt about sending it at all. The flap has been opened and closed again. I presume this is Ligsey. His real name is William Liggs. He's had no convictions, but he hasn't been above suspicion. You'll see him. "If he comes," said Mr. Reader. "So many of these gentlemen who undertake to supply information think better of it at the last moment." "It may be too late," said Gaylor. It was at the end of a very heavy and tiring day that Mr. Reader went back to his house, forgetting the appointment he had so rashly made. He had hardly got into the house before the bell rang, and it was then that he realized, with bitter regret, that he had robbed himself of an hour's sleep which was badly needed. Mr. Desboyne was in evening dress. He had driven down from his club, where he had bathed and changed after his long journey from the west of England, he explained. "I feel very ashamed to bother you at this hour of the night, Mr. Reader," he said with an apologetic smile, "but I feel rather like the villain of the piece, and my vanity has made me put matters right." Mr. Reader looked round helplessly for a chair, found one and pointed to it, and Desboyne drew it up to the table where the detective was sitting. He was a man of 33 or 35, good-looking, with a very pleasant open face and a pair of grey eyes that twinkled good-humouredly. "You saw the fight?" "Gosh, that fellow could punch. I thoroughly deserved what I got, which certainly wasn't very much. I was very rude to him. But then, like a fool, I went to the other extreme and have got him a job in Singapore. Of course he'll take it, and I'm most anxious to get out of my offer." Mr. Reader looked at him in astonishment, and the young man laughed ruefully. "I suppose you think I'm a queer devil? Well, I am. I'm rather impetuous, and I've got myself into a bit of a hole. And it's a bigger hole than I knew, because I'm terribly fond of Anna Welford, and she's terribly unfond of me. Southers is rather in the position of a successful rival, so that everything I say or do must be suspect. That's the awful thing about it." "Why do you wish to cancel the appointment?" asked Mr. Reader. He could have added that, so far as he could recall, the appointment had already been cancelled. Clive Desboyne hesitated. "Well, it's a difficult story to tell." He rose from his seat and paced up and down the room, his hands thrust into his pockets, a frown on his face. "Do you remember the night of the fight? I don't suppose that's graven on your memory. It arose out of something I said to our friend as we left the city hall. Apparently, I only discovered this afterwards. There was a man out there waiting to see Southers, but in the excitement of our little fracas, which began in the city, by the way, Southers didn't see the man, who either followed him to Lewisham or came on ahead of him. He must have been present in the street when the fight took place. When I got home that night, the hall porter asked me if I would see a very seedy-looking individual, and, as I wasn't in the mood to see anybody, I refused. A few days later, I was stopped in Piccadilly by a man who I thought was a beggar, a healthy-looking beggar, but most beggars are that way. He started by telling me he'd seen the fight, and said he could tell me something about Southers. I wasn't feeling so very savage then as I had been, and I'd have hoofed him off, but he was so insistent, and in the end I told him to call at my flat. He came that night and told me the most extraordinary story. He said his name was— Clive Desboyne frowned. "The name slipped me for the moment, but it will come back. He was a mate or assistant on a barge run by a man named Attymar." "Ligsey?" suggested Mr. Reader, and the other nodded. "That's the name, Ligsey. I'm cutting the story short because it took a tremendous long time to tell, and I don't want it to bore you as it bored me. They've been running some kind of contraband up the river on the barge, for apparently Attymar is a smuggler on a large scale. That was a yarn I didn't believe at first, though. From the things he told me, it seemed very likely that he spoke the truth. Certain articles were smuggled up the river on the barge, and others were passed through the customs by Southers." Mr. Reader opened his mouth very wide. "Now I'll tell you the truth." Clive Desboyne's voice was very earnest. "I wanted to believe that story. In my heart of hearts, I dislike John Southers. I'd be inhuman if I didn't. At the same time, I wanted to play the game. I told this fellow he was a liar, but he swore it was true. He thinks the police are going to arrest Attymar, and when they do, Attymar will spill the beans, to use his own expression. In the meantime, I have recommended Southers to a very important and responsible job in Singapore, and naturally, if this story comes out, I'm going to look pretty foolish. I don't mind that," he added quietly, "but I do mind Anna Welford marrying this man." Mr. Reader plucked at his lower lip. "Do you know Attymar?" The young man shook his head. "I can't even say that I know Ligsey, but if he keeps his promise, I shall know Attymar tomorrow morning." "What was his promise?" asked Mr. Reader. "He says Attymar has documentary proof. He didn't use that expression, but that is what he meant, and that he was going to Attymar's house tonight to get it." Again Mr. Reader thought, staring into vacancy. "When did you see him last?" "The morning I wrote to you, or rather the morning you received the letter." He made a little gesture of despair. "Whatever happens, Anna's going to think I'm the biggest cad." The telephone bell rang sharply. Mr. Reader, with a murmured apology, took up the receiver and listened with a face that did not move. He only asked, "What time?" and after a long pause, said, "Yes." As he was hanging up the receiver, Desboyne went on, "What I should like to do is to see Attymar." Mr. Reader shook his head. "I'm afraid you won't see Attymar. He was murdered between 9 and 10 tonight." Chapter 4. It was 12:30 when Mr. Reader's taxi brought him into Shadwick Lane, which was alive with people. A police cordon was drawn across the gate, but Gaylor, who was waiting for him, conducted him into the yard. "We're dragging the river for the body," he explained. "Where was it committed?" asked Mr. Reeder. "Come inside," said the other grimly, "and then you will ask no questions." It was not a pleasant sight that met Mr. Reeder's eyes, though he was a man not easily sickened. The little sitting room was a confusion of smashed furniture, the walls splashed with red. A corner table, however, had been left untouched. Here were 2 glasses of whiskey, one full, the other half empty. A half-smoked cigar was carefully laid on a piece of paper by the side of these. "The murder was committed here, and the body was dragged to the edge of the wharf and thrown into the water," said Gaylor. "There's plenty of evidence of that. We've taken possession of a lot of papers, and we found a letter on the mantelpiece from a man named Suthers, John Suthers. No address, but evidently from the handwriting a person of some education. At 9:25 tonight, Attymar had a visitor, a young man who was admitted through the wicket gate and who was seen to leave at 25 minutes to 10, about 10 minutes after he arrived." Gaylor opened an attaché case and took out a battered, cheap silver watch, which had evidently been under somebody's heel. The glass was smashed, the case was bent out of shape. The hands stood at 9:30. One of the people here recognized this as Ligsey's, a woman who lives in the street who had pawned it for him on one occasion. It's important because it probably gives us the hour of the murder if you allow the watch to be a little fast or slow. It's hardly likely to be accurate. We have sent a description round of Suthers, though it isn't a very good one, but it will probably be sufficient. I'm having a facsimile of the writing. I can save you the trouble. Here is the young man's address. Mr. Reeder took a notebook from his pocket, scribbled a few lines, and handed it to the detective. He looked glumly at the blood-stained room and the evidence of tragedy, followed the detective in silence, whilst Gaylor, with the aid of a powerful light, showed the telltale stains leading from the wharf and— "Very interesting," said Mr. Reeder. "When you recover the bodies, I should like to see them." He stared out over the river, which was covered by a faint mist, not sufficient to impede navigation, but enough to shroud and make indistinct objects 30 or 40 yards away. "The barge is at Greenwich, I think," he said, after a long silence. "Could I borrow a police launch?" One of the launches was brought into the crazy wharf, and Mr. Reeder lowered himself gingerly, never losing grip of the umbrella which no man had seen unfurled. It was a chilly night, an easterly wind blowing up the river, but he sat in the bow of the launch motionless, sphinx-like, staring ahead as the boat streaked eastwards towards Greenwich. It drew up by the side of the barge, which was moored close to the Surrey shore, and a quavering voice hailed them. "That you, Ligsey?" Mr. Reeder pulled himself on board before he replied. "No, my boy," he said gently. "It is not Ligsey." "Were you expecting him?" The youth held up his lantern, surveyed Mr. Reeder, and visibly quailed. "You're a copper, ain't you?" he asked tremulously. "Have you pinched Ligsey?" "I have not pinched Ligsey," said Mr. Reeder, patting the boy gently on the back. "How long has he been gone?" "He went about 8. Soon after it was dark. The governor come down for him." "The governor come down for him," repeated Mr. Reeder in a murmur. "Did you see the governor?" "No, sir. He shouted for me to go below. Ligsey always makes me go below when him and the governor have a talk." Mr. Reeder drew from his pocket a yellow carton of cigarettes and lit one before he pursued his inquiries. "Then what happened?" "Ligsey come down and packed his ditty box and told me I was to hang on all night, but that I could go to sleep. I was frightened about being left alone on the barge." Mr. Reeder was already making his way down the companion to Ligsey's quarters. Evidently all the man's kit had been removed. Even the sheets on his bed must have been folded and taken away, for the bunk was tumbled. On a little swing table, which was a 4-foot plank suspended from the deck above, was a letter. It was not fastened, and Mr. Reeder made no scruple in opening and reading its contents. It was in the handprint which, he had been informed, was the only kind of writing Attymar knew. "Dear Mr. Suthers, if you come aboard, the stuff is in the engine room. I have got to be very careful because the police are watching." When he questioned the boy, whose name was Hobbs, he learned that Ligsey had come down and left the letter. Mr. Reader went aft and found the hatchway over the little engine room unfastened and descended into the strong-smelling depths where the engine was housed. It was here evidently that Attymar remained during his short voyages. There was a signal bell above his head, and a comfortable armchair had been fixed within reach of the levers. His search here was a short one. Inside an open locker, he found a small square package wrapped in oiled paper, and a glance at the label told him its contents, even though he did not read Dutch. Returning to the boy, he questioned him closely. It was no unusual thing for Attymar to pick up his mate from the barge. The boy had once seen the launch and described it as a very small tender. He knew nothing of Mr. Southers, had never seen him on board the ship, though occasionally people did come, on which occasions he was sent below. At his request, Mr. Reader was put ashore at Greenwich and got on the telephone to Gaylor. It was now 2 o'clock in the morning, and much had happened. "We arrested that man, Southers, found his trousers covered with blood. He admits he was at Attymar's house tonight and tells a cock-and-bull story of what he did subsequently. He didn't get home till nearly 12. "Extraordinary," said Mr. Reader, and the mildness of the comment evidently irritated Inspector Gaylor. "That's one way of putting it, but I think we've made a pretty good capture," he said. "We've got enough evidence to hang him. Attymar's left all sorts of notes on his invoices." "Amazing," said Mr. Reader, and gathered from the abruptness with which he was cut off that for some mysterious reason he had annoyed the man at Scotland Yard. He sent back a short report with the documents and the drugs to Scotland Yard and drove home by taxi. It was 3 o'clock by the time he reached Brockley Road, and he was not surprised to find his housekeeper up and to hear that Anna Welford was waiting for him. She was very white and her manner was calm. "You've heard about Johnny being arrested," she began. Mr. Reader nodded. "Yes, I gave them the necessary information as to where he was to be found," he said, and he saw the colour come and go in her face. I suppose you had to do your duty," she said haltingly. "But you know it's not true, Mr. Reader. You know Johnny. He couldn't—" Her voice choked. Mr. Reader shook his head. "I don't know Johnny, really," he said apologetically. "He is, the merest acquaintance, Miss Welford. I am not saying that in disparagement of him, because obviously quite a number of people who aren't my friends are respectable citizens. Did you see him before he was arrested?" She nodded. "Immediately before?" "Half an hour before. He was terribly disappointed. He had gone to see about this partnership, but he had a feeling that he'd been tricked, for nothing came of it. He had arranged to see me, and I waited up for him. He was crossing the road to his own house when he was arrested." "Did he wear a blue suit or a grey suit?" "A blue suit," she said quickly. Mr. Reader looked at the ceiling. "Of course he wore a blue suit. Otherwise, he scratched his chin irritably. "It was a cold night, too. I can't understand until I have seen his, trousers." She looked at him in bewilderment, a little fearfully, and then suddenly Mr. Reader gave one of his rare smiles and dropped a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I shouldn't be too worried if I were you," he said, with a kindly look in his eyes. "You've got quite a number of good friends, and you will find Mr. Desboyne will do a lot to help your Johnny." She shook her head. "Clive doesn't like Johnny," she said. "That I can well believe," said Mr. Reader good-humouredly. "Nevertheless, unless I'm a bad prophet, you will find Mr. Desboyne the one person who can clear up this, unpleasantness. But who was the man who was killed? It's all so terribly unreal to me. Attymar was his name, wasn't it? Johnny didn't know anybody named Attymar. At least he didn't tell me so. I'm absolutely stunned by this news, Mr. Reader. I can't realize its gravity. It seems just a stupid joke that somebody's played on us. Johnny couldn't do harm to any man." "I'm sure he couldn't," said Mr. Reader soothingly, but that meant nothing. Chapter 5. Mr. Reader's housekeeper had, since his arrival, behaved with a certain secretiveness which could only mean that she had something important to communicate. It was after he had seen the girl to her house that he learned what the mystery was all about. "The young gentleman who came to see you last night," she said in a low voice. I've put him in the waiting room." "Mr. Desboyne?" "That's the name," she nodded. "He said he wouldn't go until he'd seen you." In a few seconds, Clive Desboyne was shown in. "I've only just heard about Souther's arrest. It's monstrous, and I was being so beastly about him tonight. Mr. Reader, I'll spend all the money you want to get this young man out of his trouble. My God, it's awful for Anna." Mr. Reader pulled at his long nose and said he thought it was rather unpleasant. "And," he added, "for everybody. They say this man Ligsey is also dead. If I'd had any sense, I'd have brought over the note I had of our conversation." "I could call up for it in the morning," said Mr. Reader, and his voice was surprisingly brisk. Mr. Desboyne gazed at him in startled astonishment. It was as though this weary man with the drooping lips and tired eyes had suddenly received a great mental tonic. "You made notes?" "Not 1 man in 10 would have thought of that," said Mr. Reader. "I thought I was the only person who did it." Clive Desboyne laughed. "I've given you the impression that I'm terribly methodical," he said, "and that isn't quite exact." He looked at the watch on his wrist. "It's too late to ask you to breakfast." "Breakfast is my favorite meal," said Mr. Reader gaily. Late as was the hour, he was standing before the polished mahogany door of 974 Memorial Mansions, Park Lane, at 9 o'clock next morning. Mr. Desboyne was not so early a riser, and indeed had doubted whether the detective would keep his promise. Mr. Reader was left standing in the hall whilst the servant went to inquire exactly how this strangely appearing gentleman should be disposed of. There was plenty to occupy Mr. Reader's attention during her absence, for the wide hall was hung with photographs which gave some indication of Desboyne's wide sporting and theatrical interests. There was one interesting photograph, evidently an enlargement of a snapshot, showing the House of Commons in the background, which held Mr. Reader's attention, the more so as the photograph also showed the corner of Westminster Bridge, across which motor buses were moving. He was looking at this when Clive Desboyne joined him. "Here is a piece of detective work," said Mr. Reader triumphantly, pointing to the photograph. "I can tell you almost the week that picture was taken. Do you see those 2 omnibuses bearing the names of 2 plays? I happen to know there was only 1 week in the year when they were both running together." "Indeed," said Desboyne, apparently not as impressed by this piece of deduction as Mr. Reader had expected. He led the way to the dining room, and Reader found by the side of his plate 3 foolscap sheets covered with writing. "I don't know whether you'll be able to read it," said Desboyne, "but you'll notice there are 1 or 2 things that I forgot to tell you at our interview. I think on the whole they favour Southers, and I'm glad I made a note of them. For example, he said he had never seen Southers and only knew him by name. That, in itself, is rather curious." "Very," said Mr. Reader. "Regarding that photograph in the hall, it must have been in May last year. I remember some years ago, by a lucky chance, I was able to establish the date on which a cheque was passed, as distinct from the date on which it was drawn, by the fact that the drawer had forgotten to sign one of his initials." It was surprising how much Mr. Reader, who was not as a rule a loquacious man, talked in the course of that meal. Mostly, he talked about nothing. When Clive Desboyne led him to the murder, Mr. Reader skillfully edged away to less unpleasant topics. "It doesn't interest me very much, I confess," he said. "I am not a member of the, criminal investigation department. I was merely called in to deal with this man's smuggling, and he seems to have smuggled pretty extensively. It is distressing that young Southers is implicated. He seems a nice lad, and has rather a sane view of the care of chickens. For example, he was telling me that he had an incubator." At the end of the meal, he asked permission to take away the notes for study, and this favour was granted. He was at the house in Shadwick Lane half an hour later. Gaylor, who had arranged to meet him there, had not arrived, and Mr. Reader had 2 men who had had semi-permanent jobs on the wharf. It was the duty of one to open and close the gates and pilot the lorries to their positions. He had also, as had his companion, to assist at the loading. They had not seen much of Attymar all the years they had been there. He usually came in on one of the night or early morning tides. Ligsey paid them their wages. There was never any change, said one mournfully. We ain't had the gates painted since I've been here. We've had the same little anvil to keep the gate open. He looked round first one side and then the other. The same little anvil was not there. Funny, he said. Mr. Reader agreed. Who would steal a rusty little anvil? He saw the place where it had lain. The impression of it still stood in the dusty earth. Later came Gaylor in a hurry to show him over the other rooms of the house. There was a kitchen, a rather spacious cellar, which was closed by a heavy door, and one bedroom that had been divided into two unequal parts by a wooden partition. The bedroom was simply but cleanly furnished. There was a bed and bedstead, a dressing table with a large mirror, and a chest of drawers which was empty. Indeed, there was no article of Attymar's visible, except an old razor, a stubbly shaving brush, and 6 worn shirts that had been washed until they were threadbare. From the centre of the ceiling hung an electric light with an opalescent shade. Another light hung over a small oak desk, in which, Gaylor informed him, most of the documents in the case had been found. But Mr. Reader's chief interest was in the mirror, and in the greasy smear which ran from the top left-hand corner almost along the top of the mirror. The glass itself was supported by 2 little mahogany pillars, and to the top of each of these was attached a piece of string. Most amusing, said Mr. Reader, speaking his thoughts aloud. Remind me to laugh, said Mr. Gaylor heavily. What is amusing? For answer, Mr. Reader put up his hand and ran the tip of his finger along the smear. Then he began to prowl around the apartment, obviously looking for something, and as obviously disappointed that it could not be found. No, nothing has been taken out of here, said Gaylor in answer to his question, except the papers. Here's something that may amuse you more. He opened a door leading to the bedroom. Here was a cupboard. It was little bigger. The walls and floor were covered with white tiles, as also was the back of the door. From the ceiling projected a large nozzle, and in one of the walls were 2 taps. How's that for luxury? Shower bath, hot and cold water. Doesn't that make you laugh? Nothing makes me laugh except the detectives in pictures, said Mr. Reader calmly. Do you ever go to the pictures, Gaylor? The inspector admitted that occasionally he did. I like to see detectives in comic films because they always carry large magnifying glasses. Do they make you laugh? They do, admitted Mr. Gaylor with a contemptuous and reminiscent smile. Then get ready to howl, said Mr. Reader, and from his pocket took the largest reading glass that Gaylor had ever seen. Under the astonished eyes of the detective, Reader went down on his knees in the approved fashion and began carefully to scrutinize the floor. Inch by inch he covered, stopping now and again to pick up something invisible to the Scotland Yard man, and placed it in an envelope which he had also taken from his pocket. Cigar ash? Asked Gaylor sardonically. Almost, said Mr. Reader. He went on with his search, then suddenly he sat back on his heels, his eyes ablaze, and held up a tiny piece of silver paper less than 1/4 of an inch square. Gaylor looked down more closely. Oh, it is a cigarette you're looking for. But Mr. Reader was oblivious to all sarcasm. Inside the silver was a scrap of transparent paper, so thin that it seemed part of the tinsel. Very carefully, however, he separated the one from the other, touched its surface, and examined his fingertips. Where's the fireplace? He asked suddenly. There's a fireplace in the kitchen. That's the only one. Mr. Reader hurried downstairs and examined this small apartment. There were ashes in the grate, but it was impossible to tell what had been burnt. I should like to say, said Gaylor, that your efforts are wasted, for we've got enough in the diary to hang Southers twice over, only I suspect you when you do things unnecessarily. The diary? Mr. Reader looked up. Yes, Attymar's. So he kept a diary, did he? Mr. Reader was quite amused. I should have thought he would, if I had thought about it at all. Then he frowned. Not an ordinary diary, of course. Just an exercise book. It begins, let me see, shall we say 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks? Gaylor gazed at him in amazement. Mason told you? No. He didn't tell me anything, partly because he hasn't spoken to me, but of course it would be in a sort of exercise book. An ordinary printed diary that began on the 1st of January would be unthinkable. This case is getting so fascinating that I can hardly stop laughing." He was not laughing. He was very serious indeed, as he stood in the untidy yard before the little house and threw his keen glance across its littered surface. "There is no sign of the tender that brought Ligsey here. The little boy on the barge was much more informative than he imagined. I'll tell you what to look for, shall I? A black, canoe-shaped motorboat, which might hold 3 people at a pinch. Remember that. A canoe-shaped boat, say 10 feet long." "Where shall I find it?" asked the fascinated Gaylor. "At the bottom of the river," said Mr. Reader calmly, "and in or near it you will find a little anvil which used to keep the gate open." Mr. Reader had a very large acquaintance with criminals, larger perhaps than the average police officer, whose opportunities are circumscribed by the area to which he is attached, and he knew that the business of detection would be at a standstill if there were such a thing in the world as a really clever criminal. By the just workings of Providence, men who gain their living by the evasion of the law are deprived of the 8th sense, which, properly functioning, would keep them out of the hands of the police. He made yet another survey of the house before he left, pointed out to Gaylor something which that officer had already noticed, namely the bloodstains on the floor and the wall of a small lobby which connected the main living room with the yard. "Naturally I saw it," said Gaylor, who was inclined to be a little complacent. "My theory is that the fight started in the sitting room. They struggled out into the passage." "That would be impossible," murmured Mr. Reader. Chapter 6. John Southers made a brief appearance at the Tower of London Police Court, a dazed, bewildered young man, so overwhelmed by his position that he could do no more than answer the questions put to him by the magistrate's clerk. Gaylor had seen him earlier in the morning. He said nothing except that he went to Attymar's house. Oh, yes, he admits that, by appointment. He says Attymar kept him waiting for some time before he opened the door, and then only allowed him to come into the lobby. He tells some rambling story about Attymar sending him to meet a man at Highgate. In fact, it's the usual man story. Mr. Reader nodded. He was not unacquainted with that mysterious man who figures in the narratives of all arrested persons. Sometimes it was a man who gave the prisoner the stolen goods in the possession of which he had been found. Sometimes it was the man who asked another to cash a forged check, but always it was a vague somebody who could never be traced. Half the work of investigation which occupied the attention of the detective force consisted of a patient search for men who had no existence except in the imaginations of prisoners under remand. "Did he see him?" asked Mr. Reader. Gaylor laughed. "My dear chap, what a question." Mr. Reader fondled his bony chin. "Is it possible to, have a little chat with our friend Southers?" Gaylor was dubious, and had reason for his doubt. Chief Constable Mason and the high men at headquarters were at the moment writhing under a periodical wave of criticism which sweeps across Scotland Yard at regular intervals, and their latest delinquency was the cross-examination of a man under suspicion of a serious crime. There had been questions in Parliament, almost a royal commission. "I doubt it," said Gaylor. "The chief is feeling rather sick about this Hanny business, and as the kick has come down from your department, it isn't likely that they'll make an exception. I'll ask Mason and let you know." Mr. Reader was home that afternoon when Anna Welford called. She was most amazingly calm. Mr. Reader, who had shown some hesitation about receiving her, was visibly relieved. "Have you seen Johnny?" was the first question she asked. Mr. Reader shook his head and explained to her that in the strictest sense he was not in the case and that the police were very jealous of interference. "Clive has been to see me," she said when he had finished, "and he has told me everything. He is terribly upset." "Told you everything?" repeated Mr. Reader. She nodded. "About Ligsey and the story that Clive told you. I understood, in a way. He is doing everything he can for Johnny. He has engaged a lawyer and briefed counsel." For the second time, Mr. Reader motioned her to a chair and, when she was seated, continued his own restless pacing. If there was any truth in that story, your Johnny should be rather well off, he said. The wages of sin are rather, high. Yet his father told me this morning, I had a brief interview with him, that young Mr. Souther's bank balance is not an excessive one. He saw her lower her eyes and heard the quick little sigh. They found the money. I thought you knew that, she said in a low voice. Mr. Reader halted in his stride and peered down at her. They found the money. She nodded. The police came and made a search about an hour ago, and they found a box in the tool shed with hundreds of pounds in it, all in notes. Mr. Reader did not often whistle. He whistled now. Does Mr. Desboyne know this? He asked. She shook her head. Clive doesn't know. It happened after he had left. He's been terribly nice. He's made one confession that isn't very flattering to me. Reader's eyes twinkled. That he is, engaged to somebody else, he suggested, and she stared at him in amazement. Do you know? One has heard of such things, said Mr. Reader gravely. I was very glad, she went on. It removed the, she hesitated, personal bias. He really is sorry for all he has said and done. Johnny's trouble has shaken him terribly. Clive thinks that the murder was committed by this man Ligsey. Oh, said Mr. Reader, that is interesting. He stared down at her, pursing his lips thoughtfully. The, police rather fancy that Mr. Ligsey is dead, he said, and there was a note of irritation in his voice, as though he resented the police holding any theory at all. Quite dead, murdered, in fact. There was a long pause here. He knew instinctively that she had come to make some request, but it was not until she rose to go that she spoke her thoughts. Clive wished to see you himself to make a proposition. He said that he did not think you were engaged on the official side of the case, and he's got a tremendous opinion of your cleverness, Mr. Reader, and so of course have I. Is it humanly possible for you to take up this case? On Johnny's side, I mean. Perhaps I'm being silly, but just now I'm clutching at straws. Mr. Reader was looking out of the window, his head moving slowly from side to side. I'm afraid not, he said. I really am afraid not. The people on your, friend's side are the police. If he is innocent, I am naturally on his side, with them. Don't you see, young lady, that when we prove a man's guilt, we also prove everybody else's innocence? It was a long speech for Mr. Reader, and he had not quite finished. He stood with his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes half closed, his body swaying to and fro. Let me see now. If Ligsey were alive, a very dense and stupid young man, quite incapable, I should have thought, of, so many things that have happened during the last 24 hours. After Anna had left, he went to Souther's house and interviewed Johnny's father. The old man was bearing his sorrow remarkably well. Indeed, his principal emotion was a loud fury against the people who dared accuse his son. He led the way to the tool shed in the yard and showed the detective just where the box had been hidden. Personally, I never go into the shed. It's Johnny's little cubby hutch, he said. The lad is fond of gardening and, like you, Mr. Reader, has a fancy for poultry. Is the shed kept locked? No, I've never seen it locked, said old Southers. The place from which the box had been extracted was at the far end of the shed. It had been concealed behind a bag of chicken seed. Mr. Reader took a brief survey of the garden. It was an oblong strip of ground measuring about 100 yards by 20. At the further end of the garden was a wall which marked the boundary of the garden which backed onto it. The garden could be approached either from the door leading to a small glass conservatory or along a narrow gravel strip which ran down one side of the house. Ingress, however, was barred by a small door stretched across the narrow path. But it's seldom locked, said Southers. We leave it open for the milkman. He goes round to the kitchen that way in the morning. Mr. Reader went back to the garden and walked slowly along the gravel path which ran between two large flower beds. At the farther end was a wired-in chicken run. Mr. Reader surveyed the flower beds meditatively. Nobody has dug up the garden? He asked, and, when the other replied in the negative, then I should do a bit of digging myself if I were you, Mr. Suthers," he said gently, "and whether you tell the police what you find or do not tell the police is entirely a matter for your own conscience." He looked up at the sky for a long time, as though he were expecting to see an aeroplane, and then, "If it is consistent with your, conscience to say nothing about your discovery, and if you removed it or them to a safe place where it or they would not be found, it might be to the advantage of your son in the not-too-distant future." Mr. Suthers was a little agitated, more than a little bewildered, when Mr. Reeder took his leave. He was to learn that the ban on his activities in regard to the Attymar murder had been strengthened rather than relaxed, and he experienced a gentle but malignant pleasure in the thought that in one respect he had made their task a little more difficult. It was Gaylor who brought the news. "I spoke to the chief about your seeing Suthers in Brixton, but he thought it was best if you kept out of the case until the witnesses are tested." Mr. Reeder's duties in the public prosecutor's department were to examine witnesses prior to their appearance in court, to test the strength or the weakness of their testimony, and he had been employed in this capacity before his official connection with the department was made definite. "At the same time," Gaylor went on, "if you can pick up anything, we'll be glad to have it." "Naturally," murmured Mr. Reeder. "I mean, you may by accident hear things. You know these people. They live in the same street. And I think you know the young lady Suthers is engaged to?" Mr. Reeder inclined his head. "There's another thing, Mr. Reeder." Gaylor evidently felt he was treading on delicate ground, having summarily declined and rejected the assistance of his companion. "If you should hear from Ligsey—" "A voice from the grave," interrupted Mr. Reeder. "Well, there is a rumor about that he's not dead. In fact, the boy on the barge, Hobbs, says that Ligsey came alongside last night in a skiff and told him to keep his mouth shut about what he'd seen and heard. My own opinion is that the boy was dreaming, but one of Ligsey's pals said he'd also seen him, or heard him. I don't know which. That's a line of investigation you might take on for your own amusement." "Investigation doesn't amuse me," said Mr. Reeder calmly. "It bores me. It wearies me. It brings me in a certain, income, but it doesn't amuse me." "Well," said the detective awkwardly, "if it interests you, that's a line you might take up." "I shall not dream of taking up any line at all. It means work, and I do not like work." Here, however, he was permitting himself to romance. That afternoon he spent in the neighborhood which Ligsey knew best. He talked with Carmen and van boys, little old women who kept tiny and unremunerative shops, and the consequence of all his oblique questionings was that he made a call in Little Calais Street, where lived an unprepossessing young lady who had gained certain social recognition. Her portrait would appear in the next morning's newspapers because she had been engaged to the missing man. She had, in fact, walked out with him, amongst others, for the greater part of a year. Miss Rosie Loop did not suggest romance. She was short, rather stout, had bad teeth and a red face. But for the moment she was important and might not have seen Mr. Reeder but for the mistaken idea she had that he was associated with the press. "Who shall I say it is?" asked her blousy mother, who answered the door. "The editor of the Times," said Mr. Reeder without hesitation. In the stuffy little kitchen where the bereaved fiancée was eating bread and jam, Mr. Reeder was given a clean Windsor chair and sat down to hear the exciting happening of the previous night. "I haven't told the press yet," said Rosie, who had a surprisingly shrill voice for one so equipped by nature for the deeper tones. "He come last night. I sleep upstairs with Mother, and whenever he used to anchor off the crick, he used to come ashore, no matter what time it was, and throw up a couple of stones to let me know he was here. About 2:30 it was last night, and Lord, it gave me a start." "He threw up the stones to let you know he was there?" suggested Mr. Reeder. She nodded violently. "And was it Mr. Ligsey?" "It was him," she said dramatically. "I wouldn't go to the window for a long time, but Mother said, 'Don't be such a fool, a ghost can't hurt you.' And then I pulled up the sash, and there he was in his old oilskin coat. I asked him where he'd been, but he was in a hurry. Told me not to get worried about him, as he was all right." "How did he look?" asked Mr. Reeder. She rolled her head impatiently. Didn't I tell you it was the middle of the night? But that's what he said. Don't get worried about anything. And then he popped off. And you popped in, said Mr. Reeder pleasantly. He didn't have a cold or anything, did he? Her mouth opened. You've seen him. Where is he? I haven't seen him. But he had a cold? Yes, he had, she admitted. And so would you have if you had to go up and down that river all day and night. It's a horrible life. I hope he's going to give it up. He's bound to get some money if he comes forward and tells the police the truth. It was very funny, me thinking he was dead. We'd been to buy our black, hadn't we, Mother? Mother offered a hoarse confirmation. And all the papers saying he was dead and dragging the river for him, and that Captain Attymar. He used to treat Ligsey like a dog. He hasn't written to you. She shook her head. He was never a one for writing. What time was this? She could tell him exactly, because she had heard Greenwich Church striking the half-hour. Mr. Reeder might be bored with investigation, but he found some satisfaction in boredom. The Allanuna still lay off Greenwich, and he hired a boat to take him to the barge. The disconsolate Master Hobbs was still on board, and even the fact that he was now commander did not compensate him for his loneliness, though apparently the police had supplied him with food and had arranged to relieve him that evening. He was very emphatic about the visitation of Ligsey. He had rowed alongside and whistled to the boy. The whistle had wakened him. From under the companion steps he had looked over and seen him sitting in the boat, a big white bandage round his head. Miss Rosie had said nothing about the white bandage, but calling on his way home, Reeder had confirmation. Yes, I forgot to tell you about that, said Rosie. I see it under his hat. I said, what's that white round your head? Fancy me forgetting to tell you that. As a matter of form, Mr. Reeder, when he got home that night, jotted down certain sequences. At some time after 8 on the night of the murder, Attymar had come in a launch, had collected Ligsey and taken him towards London. At 9:30, Johnny Southers had called at Attymar's house and, according to his story, had been sent on a fool's errand to Highgate. At some time about 11 o'clock, the murder had been discovered. Mr. Reeder put down his pen and frowned. I'm getting old and stupid, he said, reached for the telephone and called a number to which he knew Gaylor would certainly be attached at that hour. It was Gaylor's clerk who answered him, and, after about 4 minutes' wait, Gaylor himself spoke. Have you found anything, Mr. Reeder? I find I am suffering from a slight softening of the brain, said Mr. Reeder pleasantly. Do you realize I never asked how the murder was discovered? He heard Gaylor laugh. Didn't I tell you? It was very simple. A policeman on his beat found the wicket door open, saw the lantern on the ground, and the other lantern burning in the lobby of the house. What's the matter? Mr. Reeder was laughing. Pardon me, he said at last. Are you sure there wasn't an alarm bell ringing? I didn't hear of any alarm bell. In fact, I don't know that there is one. Mr. Reeder exchanged a few commonplaces, denied that he was making any inquiries about Ligsey, and, hanging up the receiver, sat back in his chair, his hands clasped about his middle and real amusement in his eyes. Later, he had a call from the solicitor engaged to defend young Southers. He also suggested that Mr. Reeder should place his services at the call of the defence, but again he refused. Opening the telephone directory, he found the number of Mr. Clive Desboyne, and it was that gentleman who answered his call. That's queer. I was just going to ring you up, said Desboyne. Have you taken up the case? I'm wavering, replied Reeder. Before I reach a decision, I'd like to have another talk with you. Could I call at your flat tonight about 9? There was a little pause. Certainly. I was going out, but I'll wait in for you. At the conclusion of this call, Mr. Reeder again leaned back in his chair, but this time he was not smiling. He was rather puzzled. Perhaps he was thinking of Ligsey. Possibly he was impressed by the generosity of this man, who was ready to spend a considerable part of his fortune to prove the innocence of a man he disliked. Whatever trains of thought started and slowed, switched into side tracks, or ran off into tributary lines, they all arrived at one mysterious destination. It will be spring cleaning, said Mr. Reeder, as he got up from his chair. Chapter 7. Reader spent the rest of the afternoon in the West End of London, calling upon a succession of theatrical agents. Some were very important personages who received him in walnut-panelled salons. A few were in dingy offices on third floors. One, and the most important of these, he interviewed in the bar of a public house in St. Martin's Lane. A fat and seedy man with a fur collar and frayed cuffs, a half-stupid tippler with no business but many reminiscences, and, as he proudly claimed, the best collection of old theatrical programmes in London. Mr. Reader, who was a good listener and very patient, heard all about the agent's former grandeur, the amount of commission out of which eminent artistes had swindled him, and at last he accompanied his bibulous companion to his lodgings off the Waterloo Road, and from 7 till 8 was engrossed in masses of dog-eared literature. Mr. Reader had a meal in a Strand restaurant and drove to Park Lane, as the lift carried him to the floor on which Desboyne's flat was situated. "I'm sure it's spring cleaning," murmured Mr. Reader to himself. He rang the bell of the flat and waited. Presently he heard the sound of footsteps echoing hollowly in the hall. Clive Desboyne opened the door with an apologetic smile. "I hope you don't mind the place being in confusion," he said. "We've started our spring cleaning. The truth is, I'd arranged to go away today if this wretched business hadn't turned up." The carpet had been taken up from the floor of the hall, the walls had been stripped, and the crystal pendant which lit the hall showed through a gauze covering. Clive Desboyne's own study had, however, been left untouched by the decorators. "I'm going to clear out to an hotel tomorrow. It'll probably be the Ritz-Carlton, but if you want me urgently, my solicitors will be able to put us in touch. Now, Mr. Reader, you're going to do this for Anna and me." Mr. Reader shook his head feebly. "You've got to do it," insisted the other energetically. "You're the only detective in London in whom I've any confidence. I know you're attached to the Public Prosecutor's Department, but I've been making a few inquiries too," he said with a little smile, "and I hear that you take outside commissions." "Banks," said Mr. Reader reverently. "Banks, not private work." "I shall insist." Clive was very earnest. "I've told Anna everything about my beastliness in regard to young Southers. Honestly, I still think that Ligsey's story was true and that Southers was making something on the side. A lot of decent fellows, otherwise perfectly honest, do that sort of thing, and I'm not condemning him. In fact, when I expressed my— what's the word for being shocked? Horror? Amazement? Suggested Mr. Reader. Well, whatever it was, I was being a hypocrite. I myself have not always been rich. I've known what it is to be devilishly poor. If I hadn't made good speculations when I was quite a kid, I should probably be worse off than Southers." "You're rather fond of the young lady," said Mr. Reader, after an interregnum of silence. Again Desboyne laughed. "Of course I am. The fact that a man is engaged to another girl, and the sweetest girl in the world, doesn't prevent him philandering. Of course, it's a caddish thing to do, and it's got me into quite a lot of trouble, but the fact remains I am terribly fond of Anna. I won't say I love her like a brother, because I'm tired of being a hypocrite. I'm going to try to get Southers out of the mess he's in, and that doesn't mean I love him like a brother either. Now, Mr. Reader, what do you want to see me about, if it isn't to tell me that you're taking up this case?" All that Mr. Reader wanted to see Clive Desboyne about was spring cleaning, but he could not say this. He had, however, a good excuse for calling. Ligsey was apparently alive, he explained. Clive Desboyne was not impressed. "I didn't worry whether he was alive or dead," he said frankly. "Naturally, I do not know what theory the police have, but I understood from the newspapers that they were concentrating on the murder of Attymar. That is the charge against John Southers. If Ligsey is alive, I'm hardly likely to meet him, unless, of course, he feels, as so many of these crooks do, that once one has given them money, they're entitled to a pension. If I hear from him, I'll let you know." As they came out into the hall, Mr. Reader's eyes wandered up and down the bare walls. "You will have this repainted, Mr. Desboyne?" he asked. "At present it is rather a delicate cream. If I were you, I should have it painted green. Green is a very restful colour, but possibly my views are, suburban." I think they are, said the other good-humouredly. Reader had made an appointment to see the bibulous agent at 10 o'clock. The agent knew where certain photographs were to be obtained and had promised to be waiting at the corner of St. Martin's Lane at that hour. Mr. Reader arrived as Saint. Martin's church clock was striking, but there was no sign of Billy Girther. He had not appeared at 10:30, and Mr. Reader decided to go to his house, for he was very anxious to complete his dossier. The landlady at Mr. Girther's lodgings had a surprising and disconcerting story to tell. Mr. Reader had hardly left, she had witnessed his departure, before a messenger came, and Billy had gone out. He had returned in half an hour, very voluble and excited. He had been given a commission to collect cabaret turns in Spain. He had to leave London some time after 9, travel all night, and catch the Sud Express in the morning. He was plentifully supplied with money. He was so excited he was nearly sober, said the uncharitable landlady. The sudden departure of an obscure music hall agent, of whose existence he had been unaware until that afternoon, did not at all distress Mr. Reader. It was the circumstances which attended his leaving, its rapidity, and, most important of all, the knowledge that was behind that sudden move, which made him alert and watchful. He might not be persona grata at Scotland Yard, but little things like that did not trouble Mr. Reader. He drove immediately to the big building on the Thames embankment, sought, nay, demanded, an interview with the chief constable, who should have been at home and in bed, but was in fact in consultation with his 5 chiefs when the detective arrived. The first message sent to Mr. Reader was cold and unpromising. Would he call in the morning? It was Gaylor who was detached from the conference to carry this message. "Go back to your chief, Mr. Gaylor," said Reader acidly, "and tell him I wish to see him this evening at once. If I see him tomorrow, it will be at the Home Office." This was a threat. Nobody knew it better than Gaylor. The exact extent and volume of Reader's power was not known. One thing was certain. He could be extremely unpleasant, and the consequences of his displeasure might even affect a man's career. Gaylor returned instantly and summoned him to the conference, and there Mr. Reader sat down and, quite uninvited, expounded a theory and supported his fantastic ideas with a considerable amount of grimy literature. "We can stop Girther at Southampton," suggested Gaylor, but Reader shook his head. "I think not. Let him soak into the continent, and then we may pick him up without any trouble. Send a man to Southampton, and let him shadow him to Paris. In Paris, he can blanket him." Mason nodded. "If your theory is correct, there must be a method of proving it," he said. "Not a simple one, perhaps." "On the contrary, a very simple one," said Mr. Reader. He turned to Gaylor. "You remember the bedroom above the one where the murder took place, or where we think it was committed? You probably took a photograph." "I'll get it right away," said Gaylor, and left the room. He was back with a sheaf of photographic enlargements, which he laid on the table. "There it is," said Reader, and pointed. "The clock?" "Yes, I noticed that." "Naturally," said Reader. "But most people who go to sea, or even bargees, have it put there." The little clock was fastened to the ceiling, immediately over the bedstead, so that anybody lying in bed could look up and tell the time. It had luminous hands, Reader had noticed. "I want you to have that clock removed and the ceiling plastered. I want you to take away the bed and put a table and chair there. In 2 days, I think I will make the further prosecution of young Southers unnecessary." "You can do as you like," said Mason. "You're well in the case now, Mr. Reader. I've put out a special call to get Ligsey, and the river police are searching all the reaches." "The river police are more likely to get Mr. Ligsey than any other section of the Metropolitan Police Force," replied Reader. Big Ben was striking 11 as he mounted a tramcar that carried him from Westminster Bridge to the end of his road. In the days, and particularly the nights, when Mr. Reader was heavily engaged in his hazardous occupation, his housekeeper remained on duty until he was ready to go to bed. She met him at the door now with a telephone message. "Mr. Gaylor called up, sir. He says he is sending you a little iron box which he wishes you to examine, and will you be careful not to touch it with your fingers because of the prints?" He didn't say which prince it was. "I think I know His Highness," said Mr. Reader, who was a little ruffled that Gaylor should find it necessary to warn him against over-smearing fingerprints. "Has the box arrived?" "10 minutes ago, sir." "When did Mr. Gaylor telephone?" She was rather vague as to this, thought it might have been half an hour before. In that case, thought Reader, it must have been immediately after he left the yard, and the box must have come on by cyclist messenger. He found it on his table in a service envelope and took it out, a heavy oblong box, about 6 inches long and 3 inches square. Pen printed on the lid, which was tacked down, were the words, "Mr. Reader, to see and return. Room 75, New Scotland Yard." Reader weighed the package in his hand. Some people remember by smell, some trust to their eyesight and the recollections of vision. Mr. Reader had a remarkable sense of weight, and he remembered something that weighed just as heavy as this. He put the package carefully on the table and rang through to Scotland Yard. Gaylor had gone. He tried him at his house, but he had not arrived. "Tell him to phone the moment he comes in," he said, and went to his desk to examine, for the third time that day, the old music hall programs and playbills, photographs, cuttings from the era and the stage, the data which he had collected in the course of the day. At 1 o'clock his housekeeper came in and asked if anything more would be required. "Nothing at all," said Mr. Reader. And then a thought struck him. "Where do you sleep?" "In the room above, sir." "Above this?" said Mr. Reader hastily. "No, no. I think you'd better stay in the kitchen until I hear from Mr. Gaylor. If you could make yourself comfortable there, in fact, if you could sleep there, I should be very much obliged." "There is nothing to be alarmed about," he said, when he saw consternation dawning in her face. "It is merely that I may want to, send a detective upstairs to, overhear a conversation." It was a lame excuse. Mr. Reader was a poor liar, but his housekeeper was a very simple soul, and except that she insisted upon going up to make the room tidy, agreed to retire to the basement. She had hardly gone when Gaylor came through, and for 5 minutes he and Reader spoke together. After this, the detective settled down to await his coming, and Inspector Gaylor did not arrive alone, but brought with him 2 expert officials from the explosives department. One of them had a delicate spring balance, and with this the package was weighed. "Allow 1 ounce and a quarter for the wood," said the expert. "And that's the exact weight of a Mills bomb. I'm sure you're right, Mr. Reader." He held the package to his ear and shook it gently. "No, nothing more complicated." He took a case of instruments from his pocket and removed a slither of wood from the lid. "Yes, there's the lever, and the pin's out," he said, after examining it under a strong light. He cut away the side and revealed a black, segmented egg shape, grinning as he recognized an old friend. "You see that?" He pointed to a little hole at the end of the box. "The fellow who brought this was taking no risks. He kept an emergency pin through until it was delivered. I'll have this out in a jiff." It was no idle promise. Mr. Reader watched with interest as the skillful fingers of the man removed the lid, catching the lever at the same time and holding it firm against the swelling side. From his pocket he took a steel pin and thrust it home, and the bomb became innocuous. "You've kept every scrap of paper, of course," said Gaylor. "There was no other packing but this?" Every piece of paper was carefully folded and put in an envelope, and the 2 explosive experts went down to pack away Mr. Reader's dangerous gift. "There was a lot you didn't tell the chief," said Gaylor at parting. "That's the trouble with you, you old devil." Mr. Reader looked pained. "That is not a very pleasant expression," he said. "But it is," insisted Gaylor. "You always keep back some juicy bit to spring on us at the last moment. It's either your sense of drama or your sense of humor." For a moment Reader's eyes twinkled, and then his face became a mask again. "I have no, sense of humor," he said. He had, at any rate, a sense of vanity, and he was irritated that his little idiosyncrasy had been so cruelly exposed to description. He was up at 6 the next morning, and by 7:30 was on his way to the Thames Valley. On the previous day he had telephoned to 8 separate boathouses between Windsor and Henley, and he was satisfied that he had found what he wanted in the neighbourhood of Bourne End. He had telephoned to the boat builder on whom he was calling, and he found that industrious man at work in his yard. "You're the gentleman who wanted to know about the Zaira? I was going to send one of my boys up to see if she was still tied up, but I haven't been able to spare him this morning." "I'm rather glad you haven't," said Mr. Reeder. "It was a funny thing you telephoning to me when you did," said the builder. "She'd just gone past on her way to Marlow. No, I've never seen her before, but I caught the name. In fact, it was because she was new in this part of the river that I noticed her. She's a 40-foot cruiser, nearly new, and I should think she's got pretty powerful engines. As it was, she made a bit of a wash." He explained that after Mr. Reeder's inquiry, he had telephoned through to Marlow, had learned that the boat had not passed, and had sent one of his assistants up the towpath to locate her. "She's lying at a private quay that runs in from the river to a big red house which has been empty for years. There's nobody on board her, and I suppose the owners had permission from the agents. Are you thinking of buying her?" That view had never presented itself to Mr. Reeder. He thought for a long time and gave the boat builder the impression that it was only a question of price that prevented him from ownership. "Yes, it's quite usual for people to tie up and leave their boats for months at a time, especially at a private quay like that. It's not safe. You get a craft full of rats, especially in the winter months. These big boats cost a lot to keep up, and you couldn't afford to have a caretaker on board." Mr. Reeder made a very leisurely way along the towpath, stopping now and again to admire the lovely reach. Although he had explicit instructions, he might have passed the narrow canal which runs in from the river, in spite of the brick bridge across, for the stream was choked with weeds and ran apparently into a tangle of trees and undergrowth. With some difficulty, Mr. Reeder reached its bank. He then saw that the canal was brick-lined. Nevertheless, though he had this indication of its edge, he walked gingerly. It opened to a larger pool, a sort of backwater. Passing a clump of bushes, he came suddenly upon the boat. The bow lay almost within reach of his hand. It was tied up fore and aft, and had a deserted appearance. Across the forepart of the boat was drawn a canvas cover, but he was prepared for this by the description of the boat builder. Mr. Reeder slipped his hand in his pocket and went cautiously along the length of the boat. He noted that all the portholes were not only closed, but made opaque with brown paper. "Is anybody there?" he called loudly. There was no answer. In midstream, a moorhen was paddling aimlessly. The sound of his voice sent it scurrying to cover. The foremost part of the ship was evidently the engine room, and possibly accommodation for a small crew. The living saloon was aft. It was these that had their portholes covered. Both cabins were approached from the well-deck amidships, and he saw here a canvas-covered wheel. The doors were padlocked on the outside. Mr. Reeder looked around and stepped onto the boat down a short ladder to the well. He tried the padlock on the saloon door. It was fast, but it was a very simple padlock, and if fortune favored him and the boat he sought was really discovered, he had prepared for such an emergency as this. He tried 3 of the keys which he took from his pocket before the lock snapped back. He unfastened the hasp, turned the handle, and pulled open the door. He could see nothing for a moment. Then he switched on an electric hand lamp and sent its rays into the interior. The saloon was empty. The floor of it lay possibly 18 inches below the level of the deck on which he was standing. And then, lying in the middle of the floor and glittering in the light of his lamp, was a white-handled, silver-plated revolver. "Very interesting," said Mr. Reeder, and went down into the saloon. He reached the bottom of the steps and turned, walking backwards with his face to the door through which he had come, the muzzle of his Browning covering the opening. Presently his heel kicked the pistol. He took another step back and stooped to pick it up. Chapter 8. Mr. Reeder was conscious of a headache and that the light shining in his eyes was painful. It was a tiny globe which burned in the roof of the cabin. Somebody was talking very distressedly. The falsetto voices Mr. Reeder loathed. His senses came back gradually. He was shocked to find himself one of the figures in a most fantastical scene, something which did not belong to the great world of reality in which he lived and had his being. He was part of an episode, torn bodily from a most imaginative and impossible work of fiction. The man who sat in one corner of the lounge, clasping his knees, was— Mr. Reader puzzled for a word. Theatrical, of course. That red silk robe, that Mephistophelian cap, and the long black mask with the lace fringe that even hid the speaker's chin. His hands were covered with jeweled rings, which scintillated in the feeble light overhead. Mr. Reader could not very well move. He was handcuffed, his legs were strapped painfully together, and in his mouth was a piece of wood lightly tied behind his ears. It was not painful, but it could be, he realized. At any rate, he was spared the necessity of replying to the exultant man who sat at the other end of the settee. "Did you hear what I said, my master of mystery?" He spoke with a slightly foreign accent, this man in the red robe. "You are so clever, and yet I am more clever, eh? All of it I planned out of my mind. The glittering silver pistol on the floor, that was the only way I could get you to stoop and bring your head into the gas. It was a very heavy gas which does not easily escape, but I was afraid you might have dropped a cigarette, and that would have betrayed everything. If you had waited a little time, the gas would have rolled out of the open door. But no, you must have the pistol. So you stooped and picked it up, and voila." His hands glittered dazzlingly. "You are used to criminals of the stupid kind," he went on. "For the first time, my reader, you meet one who has planned everything step by step. Pardon me." He stepped down to the floor, leaned forward, and untied the gag. "I find it difficult if conversation is one-sided," he said pleasantly. "If you make a fuss, I shall shoot you, and that will be the end. At present, I desire that you should know everything. You know me." "I'm afraid I haven't that pleasure," said Mr. Reader, and the man chuckled. "If you had lived, I would have been your chief case, your chef d'oeuvre, the one man of your acquaintance who could plan murder and, what is the expression, get away with it. Do you know where you are?" "I'm on the Zaira," said Mr. Reader. "Do you know who is her owner?" "She is owned by Mr. Clive Desboyne." The man chuckled at this. "Poor fellow. The lovesick one, eh? For him this boat is— Where do you think? At Twickenham, for its spring repairs. He told you perhaps he had been mad enough to let it for 2 months. No, he did not tell you. Ah, that is interesting. Perhaps he forgot." Mr. Reader nodded slowly. "Now tell me, my friend, my time is very short, and I cannot waste it here with you. Do you know who killed Attymar?" "You are Attymar," said Mr. Reader, and was rewarded by a shrill chuckle of delighted laughter. "So clever, after all. It is a good thing I have you, eh? Otherwise—" He shrugged his shoulders lightly. "That is the very best joke. I am Attymar. Do I speak like him, yes? Possibly. Who knows?" He slipped from his seat and came stealthily towards Reader and fixed the gag a little tighter. "Where shall you be this night, do you think, with a big, heavy chain fastened around you? I know all the deepest holes in this river, and years will pass before they find your body. To think that this great London shall lose its Mr. Reader. So many people have tried to kill you, my friend, but they have failed because they are criminals, just stupid fellows who cannot plan like a general." Mr. Reader said nothing. He could not raise his hand far enough to relieve the pressure on his mouth, for attached to the center link of the handcuffs was a cord fastened to the strap about his ankles. The man in the red cloak bent over him, his eyes glaring through the holes in the mask. "Last night I tried you. I say to myself, is this man stupid or is he clever?" He spoke quickly and in a low voice. "So I send you the little bomb. I would have sent it also to Desboyne. He also will die tonight, and our friend Mr. Southers will be hanged, and there will be the end of you all. And I will go sailing to the southern seas, and no man will raise his hand against me because I am clever." Mr. Reader thought he was a little monotonous. In spite of his terrible position, he was intensely bored. The man in the red cloak must have heard something, for he went quickly to the door and listened more intently, then, mounting the stairs, slammed the door behind him and put on the padlock. Presently Mr. Reader heard him mount the side of the boat and guessed he had stepped ashore to meet whatever interruption was threatened. It was, in truth, the boat builder who had come to make inquiries, and the grey-haired man with the stoop and the white moustache and twisted face was able to assure him that Mr. Reeder had made an offer for the boat, but it had been rejected, and that the detective had gone on to Marlow. The prisoner had a quarter of an hour to consider his unfortunate position and to supply a remedy. Mr. Reeder satisfied himself that it was a simple matter to free his hands from the steel cuffs. He had peculiarly thin wrists, and his large bony hands were very deceptive. He freed one, adjusted the gag to a less uncomfortable tension, and brought himself to a sitting position. He swayed and would have fallen to the floor but for a stroke of luck. The effort showed him how dangerous it would be to make an attempt to escape before he recovered strength. His pistol had been taken from him. The silver-handled revolver had also been removed. He resumed his handcuffs and had not apparently moved when his captor opened the door, only to look in. "I'm afraid you will have to do without food today. Does it matter?" Now Mr. Reeder saw that on the inside of the saloon door was a steel door. It was painted the same color as the woodwork, and it was on this discovery that he based his hope of life. For some reason, which he never understood, his enemy switched on 2 lights from the outside, and this afforded him an opportunity of taking stock of his surroundings. The portholes were impossible. He understood now why they had been made airtight with brown paper. It would be as much as he could do to get his arms through them. Having decided upon his plan of campaign, Mr. Reeder acted with his customary energy. He could not allow his life to depend upon the caprice of this man. Evidently, the intention was to take him out late at night, loaded with chains, and drop him overboard, but he might have cause to change his mind, and that, Mr. Reeder thought, would be very unfortunate. His worst forebodings were in a fair way to being realized, did he but know. The man who stood in his shirt-sleeves, prodding at the center of the backwater, had suddenly realized the danger which might follow the arrival of a curious-minded policeman. The boat-builder would certainly gossip. Reeder had something of an international reputation, and the local police would be only too anxious to make his acquaintance. Gossip runs up and down a river with a peculiar facility. He went into the engine cabin, where he had stowed his fantastic robe and hat, and dragged out a little steel cylinder. Unfasten that nozzle, leave it on the floor near where the helpless man lay, and in a quarter of an hour, perhaps. He cold-bloodedly pulled out 2 links of heavy chain and dropped them with a crash on the deck. Mr. Reeder heard the sound. He wrenched one hand free of the cuff, not without pain, broke the gag, and drawing himself up into a sitting position, unfastened the first of the 2 straps. His head was splitting from the effect of the gas. As his feet touched the floor, he reeled. The second cuff he removed at his leisure. He was so close to the door now that he could drop the bar. It stuck for a little while, but presently he drew it down. It fell with a clatter into the pocket. The man on the deck heard, ran to the door and tugged, drew off the padlock, and tried to force his way in. "I'm afraid you're rather late," said Mr. Reeder politely. He could almost feel the vibration of the man's fury. His vanity had been hurt. He had been proved a bungler by the one man in the world he wished to impress, whilst life held any impressions for him. Then the man on the bridge heard a smash and saw some splinters of glass fly from one of the ports. There were 5 tiny air holes in one of the doors, but 4 of these had been plugged with clay. Taking the cylinder, he smashed the nozzle end through the obstruction. A wild, desperate idea came to the harassed man. Reeder heard the starting wheel turn, and presently the low hum of machinery. He heard the patter of feet across the deck and peered through the porthole, but it was below the level of the bank. He looked round for a weapon, but could find none. Of one thing he was certain, Mr. Redrobe would not dare to run for the river. There was quite enough traffic there for him to attract attention. He could not afford to wait for darkness to fall. His position was as desperate as Reeder's own had been. Bang! It was the sound of a pistol shot, followed by another. Reeder heard somebody shout, then the sound of a man crashing through the bushes. Then he heard the deep voice of Clive Desboyne. "Reeder! Are you there? How are you?" Mr. Reeder, a slave to politeness, put his mouth up to the broken porthole. It was some time before Desboyne could knock off the padlock. Presently the door was opened and Mr. Reeder came out. "Thank God you're safe," said the other breathlessly. Who was the old bird who shot at me?" He pointed towards the place where the backwater turned. "Is there a house there or a road or something?" That's the way he went. What has happened? Mr. Reader was sitting on a little deck chair, his throbbing head between his hands. After a while he raised his face. "I have met the greatest criminal in the world," he said solemnly. "He's so clever that he's alive. His name is Attymar." Clive Desboyne opened his mouth in amazement. "Attymar? But he's dead." "I hope so," said Mr. Reader viciously. "But I have reason to know that he isn't. No, no, young man. I won't tell you what happened. I'm rather ashamed of myself. Anyway, I am not particularly proud of being caught by this." He paused. "Amateur, why did you come?" "It was only by luck. I don't know why I came. I happened to phone through to Twickenham about some repairs to the boat. By the way, you must have seen a picture of it hanging in my hall. In fact, it was in that picture where you were so smart as to tell the date. I lent the Zaira at times. I lent it a few months ago to an Italian or Serbian fellow, but he so ill-used it that I sent a message that it was to be sent back to the yard. They telephoned along the river for news of it, and that's when I learnt you were down here. You look rotten." "I feel rotten," said Mr. Reader. "And you came—" "I drove down. I had a sort of feeling in my mind that something was wrong. Then I met a man who'd seen the builder, and he told me about the little old fellow. Until then, I didn't know that he was in the boat, and I came along to make inquiries. For some reason, which I can't understand, he no sooner saw me than he pulled a gun and let fly at me, and turning, went like mad through those bushes." "Have you a gun?" asked Mr. Reader. Desboyne smiled. "No, I don't carry such things. In that case, it would be foolish to pursue my ancient enemy. Let one of the Buckingham Constabulary carry on the good work. Is your car anywhere handy?" There was a road apparently within 50 yards. "By Jove," said Desboyne suddenly, "I left it outside the gates of an empty house. I wonder whether that's the place where the old bird went, and whether my car is still there." It was there, in the drive of a deserted house, the two-seater coupe which had so excited the disgust of poor Johnny Southers. With some difficulty, Clive started it up, and the action recalled something to him. "Did we leave the engines of that boat running?" he asked suddenly. "If you don't mind, I'll go back and turn them off. Then I'll notify the police, and I'll send a man to bring the Zaira into Maidenhead." He was gone 10 minutes. Mr. Reader had an opportunity of walking round the car and admiring it. Rain had fallen in the night. He made this interesting discovery before Desboyne returned. "We'll run up to Marlow, and I'll get a man to go down and collect the boat," he said as he climbed in. "I've never heard anything more amazing. Tell me exactly what happened to you." Mr. Reader smiled sadly. "You will pardon me if I do not?" he asked gently. "The truth is, I have been asked by a popular newspaper to write my reminiscences, and I want to save every personal experience for that important volume." He would talk about other subjects, however. For example, of the fortunate circumstance that Desboyne's car was still there, though it was within reach of the enemy. "I've never met him before. I hope I'll never meet him again," said Desboyne. "But I think he can be traced. Naturally, I don't want to go into court against him. I think it's the most ridiculous experience to be shot at without replying." "Why bother?" asked Mr. Reader. "I personally never go into court to gratify a private vendetta, though there is a possibility that in the immediate future I may break the habit of years." He got down at the boathouse and was a silent listener, whilst Clive Desboyne rang up a Twickenham number and described the exact location of the boat. "They'll collect it," he said as he hung up. "Now, Mr. Reader, what am I to do about the police?" Mr. Reader shook his head. "I shouldn't report it," he said. "They'd never understand." On the way back to town, he grew more friendly to Clive Desboyne than he had ever been before, and certainly he was more communicative than he had been regarding the Attymar murder. "You've never seen a murder case at first hand." "And I'm not very anxious to," interrupted the other. "I applaud that sentiment. Young people are much too morbid," said Mr. Reader. But this is a crime particularly interesting because it was obviously planned by one who has studied the art of murder and the methods of the average criminal. He had studied it to such good purpose that he was satisfied that if a crime of this character were committed by a man of intelligence and acumen, he would, escape the consequence of his deed. "And will he?" asked the other, interested. "No," said Mr. Reeder, rubbing his nose. He thought for a long time. "I don't think so. I think he will hang. I'm pretty certain he will hang." Another long pause. And yet, in a sense, he was very clever. For example, he had to attract the attention of the policeman on the beat and establish the fact that a murder had been committed. He left open the wicket gate on the, wharf, and placed a lantern on the ground and another within the open door of his little house, so that the policeman, even if he had been entirely devoid of curiosity, could not fail to investigate. Clive Desboyne frowned. "Upon my life, I don't know who is murdered. It can't be Attymar, because you saw him today, and it can't possibly be Ligsey, because according to your statement, he is alive. Why did Johnny Southers go there?" "Because he'd been offered a job, a partnership with Attymar. Attymar had 2 or 3 barges, and with vigorous management, it looked as if his business might grow into a more important concern. Southers didn't even know that this man Attymar was the type of creature he was. An appointment was made on the telephone. Southers attended. He interviewed Attymar or somebody in the dark, during which time I gather he was sprinkled with blood, whose blood we shall discover. There was a similar case in France in 1847, Madame Puyer's. He gave the history of the Puyer's case at length. That was our friend's cleverness, the blood sprinkling, the lantern placing, the removal of Mr. I forget his name for the moment, the theatrical agent of unsavory reputation. But he made one supreme error. You know the house? No, of course. You've never been there. Which house? Asked Clive curiously. Attymar's house. It's little more than a weighing shed. You haven't been there? No, I see you haven't. If you would like a little lecture or a little demonstration of criminal error, I would like to show you at first hand. Will it save Johnny Southers, this mistake? Asked Desboyne curiously. Mr. Reeder nodded. Nothing is more certain. How amazing are the, vagaries of the human mind. How peculiar are the paths into which, vanity leads us. He closed his eyes and seemed to be communing with himself all the way through Shepherd's Bush. Mr. Desboyne put him down at Scotland Yard, and they arranged to meet at the end of Shadwick Lane that same afternoon. "There is no further news of Ligsey," said Gaylor when Reeder came into his office. "I should have been surprised if there had been," said Mr. Reeder cheerfully, "partly because he's dead, and partly because, well, I didn't expect any communication from him." "You know he telephoned to the chief last night?" "I shouldn't be surprised at that," said Mr. Reeder, almost flippantly. "They talked about Johnny Southers and the case against him, and of the disappointing results of a careful search of the garden. They had dug up every bed and had done incalculable damage to Mr. Southers' herbaceous borders. Our information was that he had a couple of £1,000 cashed there in real money, but we found nothing." "How much was there in the box you discovered in the tool shed?" "Oh, only £100 or so," said Gaylor. "The big money was hidden in the garden, according to what we were told. We didn't find a cent." "Too bad," said Mr. Reeder sympathetically. Then, remembering, "Do you mind if I take a young, friend of mine over Attymar's house this afternoon? He is not exactly interested in the crime of wilful murder, but as he is providing for the defence of young Mr. Southers—" "I don't mind," said Gaylor, "but you had better ask the chief." The chief constable was out, and the opportunity of meeting him was rendered more remote when Clive Desboyne rang him up, as he said, on the off chance of getting him at Scotland Yard, and invited him out to lunch. "Anna Welford is coming. I have told her you think that Johnny's innocence can be established, and she's most anxious to meet you." Mr. Reeder was in something of a predicament, but, as usual, he rose to the occasion. He instantly cancelled 2 important engagements to meet this, and at lunchtime he sat between a delighted girl and a rather exhilarated benefactor. The one difficulty he had anticipated did not, however, arise. She had some shopping to do that afternoon, so he went alone with Clive Desboyne to what the latter described as the most gruesome after-lunch entertainment he had ever experienced. Chapter 9. A car dropped them at the end of Shadwick Lane, which had already settled down to normality and had grown accustomed to the notoriety which the murder had brought to it. There was a constable on duty on the wharf, but he was inside the gate. Mr. Reeder opened the wicket, and Clive Desboyne stepped in. He looked round the littered yard with disgust visible on his face. "How terribly sordid," he said. "I am not too fastidious, but I can't imagine anything more grim and miserable than this." "It was grimmer for the, gentleman who was killed," said Mr. Reeder. He went into the house ahead of his companion, pointed out the room where the murder was committed. "As I feel perfectly sure," he added, and then led the way up the narrow stairs into what had been Captain Attymar's sitting room. "If you sit at that table, you'll see the plan of the house, and I may show you one or two very interesting things." Mr. Reeder switched on a hand lamp on the table, and Clive Desboyne sat down and followed, apparently entranced, the recital of J.G. Reeder's theory. "If you have time." "What is the time?" Clive Desboyne looked up at the ceiling, stared at it for a while. "Let me guess," he said slowly. 4 o'clock. "Marvellous," murmured Mr. Reeder. "It is within 1 minute. How curious you should look up at the ceiling. There used to be a clock there." "In the ceiling?" asked the other incredulously. He rose, walked to the window, and stared out onto the wharf. From where he stood, he could see the policeman on duty at the gate. There was nobody watching at a little door in the ragged fence which led to Shadwick Passage. Suddenly, Mr. Clive Desboyne pointed to the wharf. "That is where the murder was committed," he said quietly. Mr. Reeder took a step towards the window and cautiously craned his neck forward. He did not feel the impact of the rubber truncheon that crashed against the base of his skull, but went down in a heap. Clive Desboyne looked round, walked to the door and listened, then stepped out, locked the door, came down the stairs and onto the wharf. The policeman eyed him suspiciously, but Mr. Desboyne turned and carried on a conversation with the invisible Reeder. He strolled round to the front of the house. Nobody saw him open the little gate into the passage. The end of Shadwick Lane was barred, but Gaylor did not remember the passage until too late. It was he who found Reeder and brought him back to consciousness. "I deserve that," said Mr. Reeder, when he became articulate. "Twice in 1 day. I am getting too old for this work." Chapter 10. One of those amazing things which so rarely happen, that 50,000 to 1 against chance, had materialized, and the high chiefs of Scotland Yard grew apoplectic as they asked the why and the wherefore. A man wanted by the police on a charge of murder had walked through a most elaborate cordon. River police had shut off the waterway. Detectives and uniformed men had formed a circle through which it was impossible to escape. Yet the wanted man had, by the oddest chance, passed between 2 detectives who had mistaken him for somebody they knew. Whilst Reeder was waiting at Scotland Yard, he explained in greater detail the genesis of his suspicion. "The inquiries I made showed me that Attymar was never seen in daylight, except by his crew, and then only in the fading light. He had established buying agencies in a dozen continental cities, and for years he has been engaged in scientific smuggling. But he could only do that if he undertook the hardships incidental to a barge-master's life. He certainly reduced those hardships to a minimum, for, except to collect the contraband which was dumped near his barge, and bring it up to the wharf he had first hired and then bought in the early stages of his activity, he spent few nights out of his comfortable bed. I was puzzled to account for many curious happenings. If Clive Desboyne had not taken the trouble to appear in Brockley at almost the hour at which the crime would be discovered, he knew the time the policeman came down Shadwick Lane. My suspicions might not have been aroused. It was a blunder on his part, even with his clever assumption of frankness, to come along and tell me the story of what Ligsey had told him, For as soon as the crime was discovered and I examined the place, I was absolutely certain that Ligsey was dead, or Clive would never have dared to invent the story. Desboyne prides himself on being a clever criminal. Like all criminals who have that illusion, he made one or two stupid blunders. When I called at his flat, I found the walls covered with photographs, some of which showed him in costume. It was the first intimation I had that he had been on the stage. There was also a photograph of the Zyra when it was going upstream, with the House of Commons in the background. Attached by the painter at the stern was a small canoe-shaped tender, which had been faithfully described to me that day by the boy Hobbs. Desboyne knew he had blundered, but hoped I saw no significance in those two photographs, especially the photograph of him dressed as a coster with the identical makeup that Attymar wore. I started inquiries and discovered that there had been a C. Desboyne who worked in music halls, giving imitations of popular characters and making remarkably quick changes on the stage. I met people who remembered him, some who gave me the most intimate details about his beginnings. For 10 years he masqueraded as Attymar, sunk all his savings in a barge, rented the wharf and house, and eventually purchased it. He is an extraordinary organizer, and there is no doubt that in the 10 years he has been working, he has accumulated a pretty large fortune. Nobody, of course, associated the barge-master with this elegant young man who lived in Park Lane. What Ligsey knew about him I don't know. Personally, I believe that Ligsey knew very little and could have told us very little. Attymar discovered that Ligsey was communicating with me. Do you remember the letter he sent to me? I told you the envelope had been opened, and so it had, probably by Attymar. From that moment, Ligsey was doomed. Clive's vanity was such that he thought he could plan a remarkable crime, throw the suspicion upon the man he hated, and at the same time remove Ligsey, the one danger, from his path. I should think that he had been planning Johnny Souther's end for about 3 weeks before the murder. The money that was found in the tool house was planted there on the actual night of the murder, while the money in the garden. "Money in what garden?" asked Mason. "The garden was searched, but none was found." Mr. Reader coughed. At any rate, the money in the tool house was put there to support the suspicion. It was clumsily done. The message on the piece of paper, the old invoices, as well as the story that Desboyne told me with such charming effect, were designed with two objects. One was to cover the disappearance of Attymar, and the other to ruin Southers. But perhaps his cleverest and most audacious trick was the one he performed this morning. He had me in his boat. He had been waiting for me, probably had watched me from the moment I arrived at Bourne End. Then, wearing his fantastic get-up and jealous to the very last that I should suspect him, he planned his scheme for my, unpleasant exit. I give him credit for his resourcefulness. As a quick change artist, he has probably few equals. He could go on to the bank and deceive the boat builder from Bourne End. Who could believe that he was a little old man with a humped shoulder? He could equally come to my rescue when there was no other way of throwing suspicion from himself. Unfortunately for him, I saw not only that the car had been in the grounds all night, and that his story of having driven down from town was a lie, but, certain other things. The telephone bell rang, and Mason took up the instrument. "He went out a quarter of an hour ago. You don't know where? It was Desboyne, was it? She didn't say where she was meeting him?" Reader sighed and rose wearily. "Do I understand that Miss Anna Welford has been allowed to leave her house?" There was a quality of exasperation in his tone, and Mr. Mason could not but agree that it was justified. For the first request that Reader had made, and that by telephone from Rotherhithe, was that a special guard should be put over Anna Welford. Certain of Mr. Mason's local subordinates, however, thought that the least likely thing that could happen would be that Desboyne would come into the neighborhood, and here they were right. Matters had been further complicated by the fact that the girl had gone out that day and was still out when the police officers called. She had rung up, however, a moment before Desboyne had telephoned and had given her number, which was transferred to him. Later, when she was called up at the address she had given, it was discovered that she had gone out to meet him. Nobody knew where. "So really," said Gaylor, "nobody is to blame." "Nobody ever is," snapped Mr. Reader. It was Mr. Clive Desboyne's little conceit that he should arrange to meet the girl at the corner of the Thames embankment within 50 yards of Scotland Yard. When she arrived in some hurry, she saw nothing that would suggest that anything unusual had happened except the good news he had passed to her over the telephone. "Where is Johnny?" she asked, almost before she was within talking distance, and he was amused. "I really ought to be very jealous," he bantered her. He called a taxicab as he spoke and ordered the man to drive him to an address in Chiswick. "Reader hasn't been on to you, of course. I'm glad. I wanted to be the first to tell you." "Is he released?" she asked, a little impatiently. "He will be released this evening. I think that is best. The authorities are very chary of demonstrations, and Scotland Yard have particularly asked that he should give no newspaper interviews, but shall spend the night, if possible, out of town. I have arranged with my cousin that he shall stay at his place till tomorrow." It all seemed very feasible, and when of his own accord he stopped the cab and, getting out to telephone, returned to tell her that he had phoned her father that she would not be back before 8, the thought of his disinterestedness aroused a warm little glow of friendship towards him. "I have been besieged by reporters myself, and I'm rather anxious to avoid them. These damned papers will do anything for a sensation." The swift express van of one of these offending newspapers passed the taxi at that moment. On its back doors was posted a placard: "Alleged murderers daring escape." Later, the girl saw another newspaper poster: "Police of Metropolis searching for murderer." The taxi drove up a side street, and as he tapped on the window, stopped. There was a garage a little further along, and leaving Anna, he went inside and came out in a few moments with a small closed coupe. "I keep this here in case of emergency," he explained to her. "One never knows when one might need a spare car." Exactly why he should need a spare car in Chiswick he did not attempt to explain. Avoiding the Great West Road, he took the longer route through Brentford. Rain was falling heavily by the time they reached Hounslow. She was so grateful to him for all the services he had rendered, and which, though she was unconscious of the fact, he had particularized, that she did not resist his suggestion that they should go on to Oxford. She wondered why, until they were on the outskirts of the town, and then he explained with a little smile that Johnny had been transferred to Oxford jail that morning. "I kept this as a surprise for you," he said. "Only about 3 people in London know, and I was most anxious that you should not tell." They went into a tea shop on the other side of the city, and she was puzzled why he should prefer this rather poverty-stricken little cafe to an hotel, but thought it was an act of consideration on his part of the general scheme for avoiding reporters. They lingered over tea until she grew a little restless. "We'll go to the prison and make inquiries," he told her. Actually, they did go to the prison, and he descended and rang the bell. When he came back, he was grinning ruefully. "He was released half an hour ago. My cousin's car picked him up. We can go on." It was getting dark now, and the rain continued to fall steadily. They took another route towards London, passed through a little town which she thought she recognized as Marlow, turned abruptly from the main road, and as abruptly again up a dark and neglected carriage drive. She had a glimpse of the sheen of a stagnant backwater on her left, and then the car drew up before a forbidding-looking door, and, stepping down, Clive Desboyne opened the door with his key. "Here we are," he said pleasantly, gave her his hand, and before she realized what had happened, she was in a gloomy hall smelling of damp and decay. The door thundered close behind her. "Where are we? This isn't the place," she said tremulously, and at that moment all her old suspicions, all her old fears of the man returned. "It is quite the place," he said. From the pocket of his mackintosh he took an electric lamp and switched it on. The house was furnished, if rotting carpets and dust-covered chairs meant anything. He held her firmly by the arm, walked her along the passage, then, opening a door, pushed her inside. She thought there was no window, but found afterwards that it was shuttered. The room was fairly clean. There was a bed, a table, and a small oil stove. On a sideboard were a number of packets of foodstuffs. "Keep quiet and don't make a fuss," he said. Striking a match, he lit a paraffin lamp that stood on the table. "What does this mean?" she asked. Her face was white and haggard. He did not answer immediately, and then, "I'm very fond of you. That's what it means. I shall probably be hanged in about 6 weeks' time, and there's a wise old saying that you might as well be hanged for a sheep as for a lamb. You for the moment are the lamb." The bright, shining eyes were fixed on hers. She almost swooned with horror. "That doesn't mean I'm going to murder you, or cut your throat, or do any of the things I tried to do to Mr. Reader this morning. Oh, yes, I was the fantastical gentleman on the Zaira. The whole thing happened a few yards away from where you're standing. Now, Anna, you're going to be very sensible, my sweet. There's nobody within 5 miles of here who is at all concerned." The hinges of the door were rusty. They squeaked when it was moved. They squeaked now. Clive Disboyne turned in a flash, fumbling under mackintosh and coat. "Don't move," said Mr. Reader gently. It was his conventional admonition. "And put up your hands. I shall certainly shoot if you do not. You're a murderer. I could forgive you that. You're a liar. That to a man of my high moral code is unpardonable." The dozen detectives who had been waiting for 3 hours in this dank house came crowding into the room and snapped irons on the wrists of the white-faced man. "See that they fit," said Mr. Reader pleasantly. "I had a pair this morning which were grossly oversize." The end.